Bramwell Dace didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the door to Iron Hollow's main hall like he owned the ground it stood on, his two riders flanking him close enough that the door frame barely let them through sideways. He had the kind of face that had never once been told no by anyone who wanted to keep their livelihood. Sharp jaw, cold eyes, the permanent smirk of a man who had confused wealth for righteousness so long ago he couldn't remember the difference. He looked around the room, took in the smell of fresh bread, the clean floors, the tin cups laid out in rows. Then he saw Adeline Marlowe standing at the far end of the kitchen doorway, and he laughed. Not a small laugh. A loud, dismissive, carrying laugh that made one of his riders look away in discomfort. "That's your cook?" he said to Silas, who was standing 3 feet away. "Lord help you, Creed." Silas said nothing. Dace laughed again. Adeline didn't move. If this story already has your attention, a woman who walked 8 miles in winter cold with 50 cents in her pocket and cooked her way into a fight she had no business winning, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that bell so you don't miss what comes next. Stories like Adeline's don't end quietly. Drop a comment below and tell me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this table has traveled. Now let's go back to where it started. Adeline Marlowe had been walking since before sunrise. That was not unusual for her. She had been waking before sunrise for most of her 24 years, first in her parents' restaurant kitchen in Louisiana, then in every hired kitchen she had managed to hold on to for longer than 3 months before someone decided she wasn't what they pictured when they imagined a cook. She knew what they pictured. She had stopped being angry about it somewhere around the Arkansas border, 2 years back. Anger was heavy to carry when you already had a leather bag cutting into your shoulder and boots that had been resoled once too many times. What she carried instead was a battered tin box. Inside that tin were the recipes her mother had written on whatever scraps of paper she could find. Flour sack edges, envelope backs, once the inside of a tobacco wrapper. Her father's handwriting was in there too, cramped and slanted the way left-handed men wrote when they'd been forced to switch. Every recipe her parents had spent 30 years building into the best-regarded table in their parish. That restaurant was gone now. The fire had taken it on a February night when Adeline was 16 and everything was ordinary, and then suddenly nothing would ever be ordinary again. She didn't let herself think about the fire for very long. It was the kind of memory that could stop a person walking if she gave it too much room. So she kept walking. The road into Copper Ridge, Texas cut through flat brown winter grass that stretched in every direction until it met a gray sky at the horizon. There was no softness in the landscape, no trees to speak of, just wind that found every gap in her coat and made itself at home. She had heard about the job from a woman at a dry goods counter in the last town, 40 miles back. "Iron Hollow Ranch," the woman had said, measuring out cornmeal without looking up. "Silas Creed's place. Man's been through 3 cooks in 2 months. Cowboys ran off the last one by Christmas. They say he's offering $14 a month, but between you and me, whoever takes that job is going to earn every cent." $14 a month. Adeline had done the arithmetic while she walked. She had 50 cents, enough for 1 meal, maybe 2 if she was careful. She had no bed, no room, no promise of either. She had 2 dresses, the one she was wearing and the one folded at the bottom of her bag, and the tin box of recipes, and the knowledge of what she could do when someone put her in front of a working stove. $14 a month was the foundation. 50 cents was not. So she walked. She reached the Iron Hollow Gate in the early afternoon, when the winter sun was as high as it was going to get and still providing almost no warmth. She could see the ranch buildings from the road, a big main house, a long bunkhouse, a barn that had been built by someone who understood that cattle needed more protection from wind than cowboys did, several outbuildings, and off to the left, what appeared to be a separate cookhouse with a chimney that was not producing smoke. That chimney troubled her. A cold cookhouse. At 2 in the afternoon meant either the cook had quit or nobody had gotten around to starting the stove. Neither was a good sign. She went to the barn first because barns in cold weather were usually where the man in charge could be found when he wasn't in his house. She was right. Silas Creed was working on a length of fence rail that had split, running his hands along the grain to find where the weakness started. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that had been outdoors long enough to look like it belonged there. He was somewhere near 40, she guessed. He moved like a man who had done physical work his entire life and didn't think about it anymore. He heard her come in and turned. He looked at her the way most people looked at her when they were trying to decide something. The quick, unconscious inventory that started at the face, traveled down, and arrived somewhere that wasn't quite meeting her eyes. Adeline was used to it. She waited for it to finish. "You lost?" he said. "No, sir. I heard you need a cook." He set down the fence rail slowly. "Who told you that?" "Woman at the dry goods store in Millard Creek." "Word travels." He crossed his arms. Not hostile exactly, but not welcoming either. "You done much ranch cooking?" "I've done every kind of cooking there is." "That isn't what I asked." "Fair point." She adjusted. "I've cooked for logging camps, a railroad crew, 2 boarding houses, and a hotel dining room that seated 40 on weeknights and 60 on Saturdays. And before all of that, my family ran a restaurant for 30 years. I've been in a kitchen since I was old enough to reach the counter." Silas studied her for a moment. She could see him calculating, not meanly, but practically. A big operation like this had a specific image in his head of who should be feeding it, and she was aware she wasn't matching that image in at least 2 or 3 ways. She didn't offer to help him along. She waited. "I've got 28 men," he said finally. "More during roundup. They work hard and they eat harder, and they've been eating each other's bad cooking for 3 weeks since my last cook walked out." "Why'd she leave?" Something shifted in his expression. And he left because the men made his life difficult. "What kind of difficult?" Silas looked at her steadily. "The kind that tests whether a person's got patience or doesn't. Some people don't." Adeline understood what he was telling her without quite saying it. A cook who was different in any way, too young, too old, too soft, too anything, had a harder road in a bunkhouse of men who had very little entertainment and a great deal of opinion. She had encountered that road before. "Give me one supper," she said. "If they don't eat it, I'll leave tonight and you won't owe me anything." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "Cookhouse is unlocked," he said. "Whatever's in the larder is yours to use." The larder was a disaster, not in terms of quantity. There was plenty to work with. But whoever had been buying supplies had no system, no logic, no understanding of how one ingredient connected to another. There were 3 sacks of dried beans and no salt pork to cook them with. There was good flour, but the baking soda was old enough to be nearly useless. Someone had bought dried peppers without understanding that dried peppers without fat and thyme were just heat with no flavor. And the stove. The stove was a cast iron range that had clearly been a good piece of equipment once, maybe 15 years ago. Now it had a cracked firebox plate on the left side, a warped oven door that wouldn't seal properly, and a flue that needed cleaning badly enough that the first time she lit it, the smoke backed up into the kitchen and made her eyes water for 10 minutes. She got it burning properly eventually. It took longer than it should have and used more wood than she would have liked, but she got there. The young woman sitting on a stool near the back wall watching all of this was maybe 16, with red raw hands and a watchful expression that had learned not to show too much. "You Nellie?" Adeline asked. She had been told there was a kitchen helper. "Yes, ma'am." "You know where everything is in this kitchen?" "Most of it." "Good. I need you to find me every onion on this property, every potato, and if there is any butter anywhere, I need to know right now." Nellie looked at her with the faint suspicion of someone who had watched adults make promises the kitchen couldn't keep. "What are you making?" "Something those men have not eaten in a while." "What's that?" "Something that tastes like someone actually cared about cooking it." Nellie considered this. Then she got off the stool. Adeline worked. She had been in bad kitchens before, and she knew that a bad kitchen was still a kitchen. The warped oven door meant she had to watch the heat differently. The cracked firebox plate meant she had to position the cast iron away from the weak spot. The old baking soda meant she used twice what the recipe would normally call for, and added a touch of cream of tartar she found in the back of a shelf behind 3 years of accumulated clutter. She broke down the beef into cuts that could take different treatment. The tougher pieces went into the pot first with onions, dried peppers, and every scrap of fat she could render from the trimmings. The better cuts she seasoned hard with salt and pepper and a dried spice mix she had brought in her bag because she never traveled without it. Beans went on early. They needed time and they needed patience, and she gave them both. Biscuits were last because biscuits needed a hot oven, and she had to time the stove carefully with the cracked plate and the bad seal. Nellie moved around the kitchen with increasing purpose. She had started out slow and hesitant, doing only what she was specifically asked. By the second hour, she was anticipating moving the pot when Adeline's hands were full, finding the right ladle without being told, refilling the wood box before she had to ask. "Your mother teach you kitchen work?" Adeline asked at one point. Nellie's expression tightened. "No, ma'am." Adeline didn't push. "Well, you've got the instinct for it. That's harder to teach than the technique." Nellie looked at her sideways, like she wasn't sure whether to believe that. Then she went back to stirring. The men came in at 6. Adeline heard them before she saw them, boots on the plank floor of the cookhouse. The particular heavy shuffle of men who had worked outdoors all day in cold weather and were now moving toward heat and food with single-minded purpose. She heard the first one stop. The sound traveled differently when something caught a person off guard. The shuffle changed. There was a brief silence. Then, "Something smells different." Different good or different bad? Different good. Definitely different good. More boots. More stops. More silence of the kind that meant something was landing correctly. Adeline kept her back to the room and finished ladling the stew into the serving pot. She could feel the attention of 28 men in the way the air in the room changed. Not hostile, not yet, just intensely aware. Then the first comment came. It came from somewhere in the middle of the group. She didn't see who said it, only heard it. A low comment with a note of amusement in it, the kind of observation men made in groups when they thought they were being quiet and weren't. Nellie's head came up. Her expression went flat and hard in the way of someone who had learned to hear those comments and absorb them without flinching. Adeline turned around. She found the general direction the comment had come from. A cluster of men near the left side of the long table, 3 or 4 of them, the kind of grouping where accountability disappeared because nobody was quite sure who had said what. She looked at them directly. "Food's hot," she said, her voice completely level. "Biscuits are coming out in 4 minutes. Anyone who'd rather spend that time talking is welcome to wait outside." Silence. Real silence this time. She turned back to the stove. The biscuits came out in 4 minutes. Nobody waited outside. She knew a meal had worked when the talking stopped. Not the talking of discomfort or boredom. She knew that kind too. The forced conversation people made to fill space when food was something to get through rather than something to be present for. She meant the other kind. The quiet that came when every person at a table was actually engaged with what was in front of them. The involuntary hush of people who had forgotten, for a few minutes, that they were supposed to be performing their ordinary personalities. That hush settled over Iron Hollow's cookhouse like a hand coming to rest. The stew went first. She watched from the kitchen doorway. Not hovering, just aware, as bowls were refilled once, then again. Men who she had been told were chronic complainers about food were eating in focused, deliberate silence. An older cowboy near the end of the table, gray-whiskered with the permanent squint of a man who'd spent decades looking at open range, ate half a bowl, and then just sat for a moment looking at it like he was trying to identify something. "That pepper," he said to nobody in particular. "There's something in that pepper." "Don't ask," the man next to him said, already on his 3rd biscuit. Nellie moved around the table refilling coffee and water, and Adeline noticed that nobody made comments at her. The room's attention was elsewhere. That was its own small result. She was finishing the cleanup when she heard the boots she recognized as Silas Creed's, but heavier than the others, more deliberate, coming toward the kitchen. She didn't look up from the pot she was scrubbing. She heard him finish the bowl he had carried in. Then she heard him set it down on the counter beside her without saying anything. Then she heard him pick it up again. She kept scrubbing. A few minutes later, he came back and put the bowl down again, empty a second time. "Who taught you to cook like that?" he said. She looked up at him then. "My mother." Silas looked at her the way he had not looked at her when she had first walked into his barn that afternoon. He was seeing something different now, or maybe seeing the same thing differently. She wasn't sure which. She had stopped trying to track those moments, the moments when people revised their opinions, because they didn't always lead anywhere reliable. "You're hired," he said, $14 a month. He didn't flinch. $14 a month. "And the cookhouse is mine. I run it the way I see fit." A pause. Not resistance, More like recalibration. What does that mean? It means if I decide something needs changing, I change it. If I need supplies, you buy them. If someone in that room is making life in this kitchen difficult for me or for Nellie, I tell you and you handle it. And if I don't handle it, then I handle it, she said, and one of us will be less comfortable than the other. Silas Creed was quiet for a moment. Then he put out his hand. She shook it. The first 2 weeks were a negotiation that never quite announced itself as one. The cookhouse was Adeline's territory by agreement, but territory has to be established in practice, not just in words. Silas had said she ran the kitchen, but 28 men who had been running roughshod over kitchen arrangements for months had their own understanding of how things worked. The first test came on the third morning. A cowboy named Rhett, 20 years old, broad as a barn door, convinced that his size gave his opinions extra weight, came into the cookhouse at 5:30 in the morning and told Adeline he needed his eggs fried hard because soft yolks made him sick. "Breakfast is at 6, Adeline said, without looking up from the bread dough she was working. "I'm up at 5. "Then you've got 30 minutes to find something to do." Rhett looked at the back of her head. "I could go get Mr. Creed?" "You could," Adeline agreed. "He'd tell you breakfast is at 6. She heard him stand there for a moment longer. Then she heard him leave. Breakfast at 6. Hard fried eggs in front of Rhett's place specifically, because she had made a note and she didn't forget things like that. But at 6. He ate them without saying anything. The second test was more complicated. It came from the smokehouse, or rather from the state of the smokehouse, which Adeline had inspected on her second day and found to be in a condition that represented either profound neglect or a genuinely staggering lack of understanding about how smoked meat worked. The hooks were rusted. The wood supply was wrong, green pine instead of hardwood, which produced a bitter smoke and coated everything in creosote. There was meat in there that should have been thrown out 3 weeks ago, she told Silas. He looked at the smokehouse with the expression of a man who had never thought about a smokehouse as something requiring expertise. "What do you need?" "Hardwood. Hickory if you can get it, oak if you can't, and someone to help me clean it out. I'll send a couple of men." "Send men who can follow direction without commentary." Silas looked at her sideways. "That's a specific request." "I found it's a useful one." He sent 2 men, quiet, competent cowboys named Doran and Petey, who did exactly what she asked without expressing opinions about why a woman was running a smokehouse restoration. By the end of the second day, the smokehouse was clean and stocked with the right wood, and Adeline had 3 sides of pork belly hanging correctly and 2 venison haunches that someone had brought in from hunting positioned where they'd get proper airflow. It was Nellie who said it first. She said it quietly while they were finishing up the evening's dishes, in the way that young people said true things when they weren't sure if they were allowed to. "This kitchen feels different now." Adeline rinsed a pot. "Different how?" Nellie thought about it. "Like someone's paying attention." The Sunday that changed everything started as a disaster. Adeline had agreed to take on an extra cooking day, Sunday noon meal, as part of her arrangement with Silas. It was supposed to be a simpler meal than the weekday dinners, beef and root vegetables, bread, dried apple pie. She was in the middle of it when 3 things went wrong almost simultaneously. The flu she had been nursing for 2 weeks finally failed completely, backing smoke into the kitchen badly enough that she had to pull the stove dampers and let the fire die down, which meant the oven temperature dropped 30 degrees at exactly the wrong moment. One of the flour sacks Nellie had brought from the supply room turned out to have been sitting against the wall in standing water and was halfway to ruined. She caught it when she was already measuring, dumped it, found the next sack. And then Rhett came in again. This time with 2 other men. And this time the comment wasn't quiet. She heard it clearly. The thing he said was aimed at Nellie, and Nellie went very still in the way of someone who had learned stillness as a survival strategy, and something in Adeline's chest went cold and then very hot in rapid succession. She set down the rolling pin. She turned around. "Get out of my kitchen." Rhett blinked. The 2 men with him looked uncertain. "I said get out of my kitchen, all 3 of you, right now. We just came in for, I don't care why you came in. You're not welcome in here anymore today. Go." "You can't." "Try me." There was something in her voice that had nothing to do with volume. It was the voice of a woman who had decided something completely and was no longer in the negotiation phase. Rhett had never quite encountered that voice before. Most of the women in his experience either argued or went quiet, and he didn't know immediately what to do with it. Silas appeared in the doorway. He took in the room in one look. "Something wrong?" he said, directed at nobody in particular. "These three men," Adeline said, "are leaving my kitchen." Silas looked at Rhett. Rhett opened his mouth. "You heard her," Silas said. They left. Silas stayed in the doorway a moment. "What happened?" "Your man made a remark at Nellie that he had no business making. I'd appreciate it if you spoke to him." "I'll speak to him. And I'd appreciate it if he understood that the next time something like that happens, he goes to the bunkhouse without supper and stays there until he's remembered how to act like a grown adult." A pause. "That's a hard consequence." "It's a simple consequence," Adeline said. "I'll get back to this bread." Silas left. Nellie was very quiet for a moment. Then, "Thank you." "You don't have to thank me for that." "Most people don't say anything." Adeline went back to the bread dough. "Most people," she said, "haven't been a woman working in a kitchen." The conversation with Silas that evening, after dinner, after the men had filed out, in the quiet of the cooling cookhouse, was the first real conversation they had. Not instructions, not negotiation, a conversation. He came in while she was finishing the last of the cleaning. He didn't have a specific errand, she could tell that. He sat down at the end of the long table the way someone sits when they've been meaning to do something and finally made themselves do it. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. "Cooking professionally? Since I was 19. And before that?" "My family's restaurant. I grew up in it." "Louisiana, from how you cook." She looked over at him, mildly surprised. Most people couldn't place the cooking geographically. "That specific?" "The pepper. The way you layer it. I had a cook once from New Orleans. Different than what I'd had before." Adeline was quiet for a moment. "The restaurant burned down when I was 16. Silas was quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't filling space, just sitting with the weight of what had been said. "I lost my wife," he said eventually. Not abruptly, more like he was placing something down carefully. 3 years ago, fever came through, took her in a week. I'm sorry. The ranch got cold after that." He said it matter-of-factly, the way people spoke about things they had long since stopped expecting to fix. Not the temperature, just cold. Adeline understood exactly what he meant. She had felt it in kitchens. The difference between a kitchen that was fed by someone who cared and a kitchen that was just producing fuel. The temperature was the same either way. The warmth was entirely different. "That smokehouse bothered me for a long time," she said, not changing the subject, but moving it sideways in the way conversation sometimes needed to move. "The condition of it. A smokehouse says something about whether anyone's paying attention." Silas looked at her. "What's it say when it's that bad?" "That nobody's been home in a while." He was quiet for a long time after that. When he finally got up to leave, he stopped at the door. "There's a cattle buyer coming through next month. Big operation out of Fort Worth. Man named Calhoun. All right? If you wanted to make a Sunday noon meal for him, something that showed what this kitchen can do." Adeline wiped down the last counter. "I'll need proper lard, not the barrel stuff, and dried fruit that isn't 2 years old." "I'll see to it." He left. She stood in the quiet kitchen for a moment longer. The stove was ticking as it cooled. The smell of the evening supper still hung in the air. Good smells, real smells. The smell of a kitchen that had been used properly. She took her battered recipe tin from the shelf where she'd put it on her first day. She opened it. Her father's slanted handwriting, her mother's quick, pressed letters that never quite lifted the pen enough between words. She put it back. She had a lot of work to do. Bramwell Dace came to Iron Hollow for the first time on a Thursday in the 3rd week of February. Adeline was in the smokehouse when he arrived, which meant she heard the horses before she saw anything, and she came out around the side of the building to find 3 men tying up at the hitching post near the main house. She knew the type immediately, not from having met Bramwell Dace specifically, but from having worked in enough places long enough to recognize a particular configuration of power and entitlement when it came through a gate. The way he sat his horse had nothing to do with riding skill and everything to do with the careful maintenance of an impression. He didn't acknowledge her at all, which told her something. Not the deliberate not looking of a man trying to ignore something. The complete absence of noticing, the way wealthy men in certain moods didn't see people they had categorized below them. She was part of the landscape, like a fence post. She went back into the smokehouse and finished what she was doing. She heard the conversation later from Doran, who had a habit of appearing wherever things were happening and remembering them in careful detail. Dace had come to discuss the northern pasture, Iron Hollow's northern pasture, specifically the part that bordered his own property. He had, he said, a survey that indicated Silas's fence was sitting 22 feet inside Dace's property. Silas told him the original survey put that fence exactly where it was supposed to be, Doran said. He was mending a harness at the far end of the barn while Adeline checked the horse that had thrown a shoe that morning. Dace said the original survey was faulty, said he'd been patient long enough. 22 feet, Adeline said. How wide is the creek at that point? Doran looked at her sideways. Wide enough. In a dry summer, that pasture water's worth more than the pasture. So it's the spring. It's always the spring. She thought about this for a moment. What did Silas say? Said he'd have the original survey documents in front of a county judge inside of 30 days. And Dace? Doran's expression tightened. Dace said that was his right. Then he came inside for coffee and looked around and asked Silas who the cook was. A pause. Silas told him. Dace said... He stopped. What did he say? Nothing worth repeating. Tell me. Doran looked uncomfortable. He laughed. Said something about the irony of a man who couldn't keep his land from disappearing hiring a cook who looked like she'd eaten it. Adeline was quiet. Then what happened? She said, her voice completely steady. Silas told him she wasn't the woman working in his kitchen, she was the woman running it, and if Dace had a problem with that, he was welcome to find his coffee somewhere else. Doran's mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. Dace didn't find his coffee somewhere else. He drank it and left. Adeline went back to checking the horse's hoof, her hands doing the careful, familiar work while her mind moved over what she had just heard. 22 feet, a creek, a fraudulent survey, and a man who laughed at things he underestimated. She had met men like Dace before, not cattle barons specifically, but the same architecture underneath. Men who wielded dismissal as a weapon because it had always worked before, who operated on the assumption that the people they discounted would stay discounted. She had also learned in 24 years that the people men like Dace dismissed most completely were sometimes the most dangerous thing in the room. She put that thought away for later. For now, there was work to do. She had a Sunday meal for a Fort Worth cattle buyer to plan, a kitchen to run, and a smokehouse that for the first time in years was actually operating correctly. One thing at a time. She closed the smokehouse door behind her and went back to the kitchen, where Nellie was waiting with a question about the bread. And the stove was burning exactly the way she needed it to, and the day's work was still only half finished. The Fort Worth cattle buyer arrived on a Sunday that started badly and got worse before it got better. His name was Calhoun, just Calhoun, the way men with regional reputations often went by one name, as if the second one was unnecessary. And he rode in an hour earlier than Silas had said he would, which meant Adeline was still working the second batch of biscuits when she heard the horses and had flour on both arms up to the elbow and a pan of roasting beef that needed another 20 minutes it was not going to get. Nellie appeared in the kitchen doorway with wide eyes. He's here. I can hear that. Mr. Creed's taking him to the main house. Good. That buys us time. How much time? Adeline looked at the oven. Enough. Get me the dried cherries from the back shelf and start slicing the bread that's already done. Nellie went without another word. The biscuits came out slightly darker on the bottom than Adeline would have preferred. Not burned, she had pulled them 2 minutes before that, but browner than she liked. She stacked them in the cloth-lined basket anyway, covered them, and moved on, because imperfect biscuits on the table were more useful than perfect biscuits in her head. The beef was the problem. She had planned for a 20-minute rest before carving. She got 8. She carved it anyway, angling the knife correctly to cut against the grain and keep the slices from tightening up, working fast and clean, watching the juice run and making a quick decision to deglaze the pan with the apple cider she had been saving for the pie and turn the pan drippings into something better than she had originally planned. Nellie came back with the cherries. She watched Adeline work over the pan for 30 seconds. Is that the pie filling? She asked. It's better than pie filling now. Get the good plates. The meal was on the table 11 minutes after Calhoun sat down. Adeline didn't go out to meet him. That wasn't her job and she didn't need it to be. She stood at the cookhouse door and watched through the gap while Nellie carried in the first plates, and she watched Calhoun, a thick-necked man in his 50s with the careful expression of someone who had eaten in a lot of places and was prepared to be disappointed. Look at his plate, and then look again. He said something to Silas. She couldn't hear it, but she could see Silas's expression change in the way it changed when something had gone better than he expected, and that was enough. She went back to the kitchen and started on the cleanup. Silas found her there 40 minutes later. He wants to know if you'll cook for his buyer's dinner in March, he said. In Fort Worth. He'd pay transport and 2 days' wages. Adeline kept washing. Tell him I'm not available for hire away from Iron Hollow. Silas was quiet for a moment. That's a significant opportunity. I have significant work here. Another pause. She could feel him deciding how to say the next thing. He also asked who trained you. I told him your family ran a restaurant in Louisiana. He said that explained it. What did he mean by that? He meant it as a compliment. New Orleans cooking has a particular... I know what he meant. She handed a clean pan to Nellie to dry. What did you tell him about the Sunday meals? I told him you'd been doing them for 3 weeks. Did you tell him they're open to the county? I did. What did he say? Silas leaned against the door frame. He said that was either the smartest thing he'd heard of on a cattle ranch or the most impractical. Couldn't decide which. Adeline moved to the next pot. Come back in a month and he'll know. Calhoun left that afternoon. He shook Silas's hand at the gate and said something too quiet to hear, but he glanced back toward the cookhouse once before he rode. Adeline noticed. She also noticed later that Silas did not immediately go back to the main house after Calhoun left. He stood at the gate for a while, looking at the cookhouse, the way a man looked at something he was beginning to understand differently than he had before. She noticed that too. She didn't do anything about it. There was bread to start for tomorrow. The Sunday table, as people began calling it before Adeline had given it any name at all, grew the way a fire grew in dry grass, faster than expected, and in directions nobody had planned for. The first Sunday open to the public had drawn 11 people, a traveling family, 2 merchants from Copper Ridge, a rancher from the east who had heard something from someone about the food at Iron Hollow. The second Sunday had 22, the third brought 31, and Adeline had to send Doran on horseback to the town for more flour because she had underestimated, which was something she hated doing and was determined not to repeat. She started keeping a counting book. It was a plain ledger she had asked Silas for, just paper and a cover, nothing fancy. And in it she tracked every Sunday. How many people came, what she cooked, what ran out, what was left over, what it cost in supplies, and what came back in the tin box she set near the door with a handwritten card that said simply, "Leave what you can, take what you need." Silas had raised an eyebrow at the tin box arrangement. Some of those people could pay full price. Some of them could, and some of them can't. If I charge full price, the ones who can't stop coming. If they stop coming, the ones who can stop hearing about it. That's an indirect way to run a business. It's the only way to build one, Adeline said. He chewed on that for a while. She could tell he was chewing on it because he went quiet in a specific way. Not the absence of conversation, but the presence of thinking. She had started to distinguish between his silences, which surprised her. She didn't usually bother. What came out of the tin box every Sunday was, on average, about what she would have charged anyway, sometimes more. She did not share that information with Silas immediately. She let the accounting speak at the end of the first month, when she put the ledger in front of him at the kitchen table with the columns totaled. He looked at the numbers for a long time. This is after expenses? After every expense. Wood, supplies, extra flour, the lard I had to replace because the barrel had gone rancid, everything. And this is from a tin box people put money into voluntarily. Yes. He sat back. Adeline. Don't make too much of it yet. It'll fluctuate. You're running a business inside my ranch. I'm running a kitchen that's becoming a reason for people to come here. Those are related but different things. He looked at her. How are they different? She closed the ledger. A business makes money. What I'm building makes something that lasts after the money. When people talk about Iron Hollow, I want them talking about what happened here, not just what it cost. Silas put his hand on the ledger cover. Where did you learn to think like that? She considered the question honestly. My mother. She ran the restaurant's money, and my father cooked. People assumed it was the other way around because my father was the one in the kitchen and my mother was the one they saw up front. But the reason that restaurant lasted 30 years was because my mother knew what she was building and what she wasn't. And what wasn't she building? A restaurant, Adeline said. She was building a place. That's different. Silas was quiet for a while. The kitchen was warm around them. Outside the window, the February wind was moving through the cottonwoods at the far edge of the property, the bare branches making the sound they made in cold weather, a dry, scraping sound like something that hadn't quite found its voice yet. My wife wanted to build something like that here, he said. Not sadly, just factually, the way he had said things before when they talked about the people they had lost, as if the sadness was real but had been handled enough times that it no longer required careful packaging. She had ideas for the main house, hospitality, people stopping through. What happened to the ideas? She got sick before she could start them. A pause. I kept meaning to pick them up and couldn't figure out how. Adeline looked at him directly. The Sunday table isn't your wife's idea. I know that. I'm telling you because sometimes people get confused about where things come from. He met her eyes. I know exactly where this came from. She believed him. She also noticed that it was the most personal thing either of them had said to the other in the 3 weeks she had been at Iron Hollow, and that the saying of it had changed the temperature of the room in a way that had nothing to do with the stove. She picked up the ledger and took it back to its shelf. I need more dried peppers, she said, and someone needs to fix the flue properly before spring. I've been managing around it and I won't manage around it forever. I'll get someone out this week. Thank you. He left. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after, both hands flat on the counter, aware of the warmth in the room and the sound of the wind outside and the particular quality of a silence that meant something had shifted. Then she started on tomorrow's bread. Nellie Voss, it turned out, was 16 years old, had no living parents, had been at Iron Hollow for 7 months as a kitchen helper in the loosest possible definition of the term, and had been treated for most of that time as someone to whom instructions were given rather than skills imparted. Adeline discovered this in pieces, the way you discovered most true things about people, not in one conversation, but in the accumulation of small moments that eventually assembled into a picture. The first piece was the way Nellie held a knife. She held it incorrectly, not dangerously wrong, but wrong in the specific way of someone who had been handed a knife and told what to cut without ever being shown what the knife was actually trying to do. Adeline corrected her grip on the second day without making a production of it. Just moved Nellie's fingers to the right position, demonstrated the angle, moved on. Nellie had looked at her own hand afterward like she was seeing it differently. The second piece was what Nellie didn't know how to read. Not illiterate, she could manage basic words and numbers, but the recipe cards in Adeline's tin were beyond her, the quantities and techniques written in a shorthand that assumed knowledge she had never been given. Adeline started reading them aloud while they worked, explaining as she went, not as a lesson but as narration, the way her mother had done in the Louisiana kitchen when Adeline was small and sitting on the counter and learning without knowing she was learning. The third piece was that Nellie had nowhere to go when the day ended. She had a cot in the storage room off the cookhouse. It was cold, it was small, and it had no window. Adeline moved her cot into the main cookhouse area. Warmer, better light, closer to the stove, within the first week, and when the storeroom was properly reorganized, she turned it into a proper small room with Nellie's cot inside, a hook for hanging things, a crate for a table. Nellie had stood in the doorway of the reorganized room and said nothing for a full minute. You don't have to do all this, she finally said. I'm not doing it for you, Adeline said, which was only partly true. I'm doing it because I need my kitchen worker to sleep properly so she can work properly. Purely practical. Nellie looked at her. Is that true? Parts of it. Something almost like a smile. Okay. What changed in Nellie over the following weeks was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic, slow and internal, and expressed mostly in how she moved through the kitchen. She stopped hesitating before she acted. She stopped waiting to be told what the next thing was. She started tasting food the way cooks tasted it, critically and purposefully. And she started offering observations that were occasionally wrong and increasingly right. The beans need more time, she said one afternoon, 3 weeks in. Adeline tasted them. Nellie was correct. How do you know? The outside's done, but the center still has I don't know the word. Resistance. Yes, resistance. Good. You're right. Another 20 minutes. Nellie nodded, satisfied in a contained way, and went back to what she was doing. Adeline watched her for a moment, remembering being 16 in her mother's kitchen, and the particular feeling of being correct about something when the person who taught you confirmed it. Not the pride exactly, but the settling of it, the way a joint fit when the pieces were cut right. She went back to her own work. The argument with Rhett came to a head on a Tuesday, 5 weeks into Adeline's time at Iron Hollow. It had been building. She had known it was building the way you knew weather was building, from smaller signs, from the quality of the air, from the specific way certain people moved around certain spaces. Rhett had not forgiven being told to leave the kitchen. He had not forgiven the hard-fried eggs served at 6 instead of 5:30. He had not forgiven any number of small moments in which the boundaries of Adeline's kitchen had proven more solid than he'd expected, and because he was 20 years old and built like a draft horse and accustomed to getting his way through the combination of those two facts, he had been storing up the unforgiveness and waiting for somewhere to put it. He put it on Tuesday. He came in during the afternoon between meals when Adeline was alone in the kitchen working on the week's supply accounting. Nellie had gone to the supply room. There was nobody else around. Rhett stood in the kitchen doorway, not coming in, just standing in it, which was a specific kind of intrusion because it occupied the space without technically crossing the threshold. "People are saying you're running some kind of public eating house on Sundays," he said. Adeline kept writing in her ledger. "People are right. Using Mr. Creed's supplies. Using the supplies I've accounted for in the ranch budget, yes. Cooking for strangers. Cooking for the county, which is different from strangers." Rhett's jaw moved. "The men don't like it." She looked up at that. "Which men?" "Some of them." "Name one." He didn't. She put her pen down. "Rhett, I have been at this ranch 5 weeks. In that time, the food has improved, the smokehouse is operating correctly, the kitchen has not run out of supplies, and on Sundays, people from Copper Ridge and beyond are coming to Iron Hollow and sitting at a table and eating well and leaving with a good opinion of this ranch. What, specifically, is the complaint?" He shifted his weight. The intrusion of the doorway was becoming less comfortable. "It's not how things used to be." "No," she said. "It isn't. Some people liked how things used to be." "Did they?" she said, and it was not a question. "Tell me something. 3 weeks before I came here, when the last cook left and you were eating your own cooking, was that better?" He said nothing. "Because I asked Doran. And what Doran told me was that the coffee was bad and the beef was usually scorched, and a man named Petey tried to make biscuits and produce something closer to clay than bread." Something shifted in Rhett's expression. Not quite embarrassment. He was too young and too sure of himself for embarrassment, sure, but a recalibration. "That's not the point," he said. Then tell me the point." "The point is, you act like you own this kitchen." Adeline picked up her pen. "I run this kitchen. That's the arrangement Mr. Creed and I have. If you have a concern about that arrangement, you're welcome to take it to him." She went back to her ledger. For a long moment, Rhett stood in the doorway. Then he left. Adeline finished the column she was working on. Her handwriting was slightly tighter than usual at the bottom of the page. She noticed it and made a conscious effort to loosen it on the next line. Nellie came back from the supply room. She looked at the empty doorway. "Was someone here?" "Just Rhett." Nellie put the flour sack down slowly. "He giving you trouble?" "He's working through something," Adeline said. "Men like Rhett need time to figure out that the world has arrangements they didn't vote on and can't change. He'll get there." "What if he doesn't?" "Then he'll be hungry on Sundays." She closed the ledger. "Start on the vegetable prep. We've got 30 people coming this week." She was not wrong about 30 people. 34 came. Among them, for the first time, were 2 women from Copper Ridge who had come alone. Not with husbands or fathers, just together, 2 women in their 30s who sat at the long table and ate with the careful posture of people who weren't entirely sure they were allowed to be somewhere and were managing that uncertainty by being very polite. Adeline sent Nellie over with extra coffee. "From the kitchen," Nellie said, setting it down. "No charge." One of the women, dark-haired, sharp-faced, with the look of someone who had learned to be careful with hope, looked up and said, "Is the cook a woman?" "Yes, ma'am." A pause. The two women looked at each other with an expression Adeline recognized. It was the expression of people who had heard something was true and were now processing the fact of it. "Tell her the biscuits are the best I've had since my grandmother's," the dark-haired woman said. Nellie came back and told her. Adeline stood at the stove for a moment after. She was not sentimental by nature. Sentimentality was a luxury of people who weren't busy, and she was almost always busy. But there was something about that particular moment. Two women sitting at a table they had come to alone, drinking coffee sent over from a kitchen run by a woman like them, that landed somewhere real. She made a note in her counting book. Not the numbers. Just 2 women from town, first time. Then she went back to the stove. Bramwell Dace came back to Iron Hollow in the second week of March. This time, he didn't wait for an invitation. He rode up on a Wednesday morning with 4 men instead of 2, and he had a surveyor's map under his arm that he spread across Silas's porch railing like he was showing territory he already owned. Adeline was coming from the smokehouse when she saw them. She didn't change her route or her pace. She walked back to the cookhouse the way she always walked, directly, without hurrying, and she heard pieces of the conversation as she passed. Established reference point here, and if you measure from, that reference point isn't on the original. 22 feet, Creed. That's not a dispute, that's a trespass. She went into the kitchen and started the midday meal. Silas came in 40 minutes later. He sat at the end of the table in the way he sat when something was sitting on him, elbows on the wood, jaw set. "He's got a surveyor," he said. "I heard." "County surveyor. Man named Galt. Dace has apparently been working with him for the better part of a year." Adeline was breaking down a chicken. "A county surveyor works for the county, not for Dace." "In theory." She looked at him. "How long has Dace had influence in the county seat?" "Long enough." Silas rubbed the back of his neck. "The original survey documents are in my files. They're clear. The fence is where it's supposed to be. But Galt's map shows a different reference point, and if he takes that to a circuit judge, I could be tied up in property law for 2 years while Dace runs cattle on that creek." Adeline thought, "What does the creek mean in a dry summer?" "That pasture's water supply. Without the creek, I'd have to either truck water or move the herd south, which crowds the southern pasture." "And Dace's land to the west?" "Dry as paper in August." So it was the water. It was always the water. She went back to the chicken. "Do you have someone who can read a survey map who isn't Galt?" "There's an independent surveyor in Harrison County, man named Webb. He's good. But it takes time to get him out here, and meanwhile Dace is moving fast. He's moving fast." Adeline put the chicken in the pot and adjusted the fire. "How fast?" Silas was quiet for a beat. "Doran told me yesterday that Dace has been putting it around that the original survey was filed improperly. If he establishes that in the county record before I can get Webb out here, I'm fighting on his ground." She turned and looked at him directly. "Then get Webb out here fast." "I'm trying." "Don't try. Do." She said it without heat, just plainly. "Dace is counting on you being slow. Men like Dace always count on the other person being slower than them." Silas looked at her. "You sound like you've seen this before." "Not this exactly." She moved to the next task. "A man came after my family's restaurant once. Not for the land, for the lease. We were a year into a 3-year arrangement, and he found a flaw in the paperwork and tried to move us out so he could put in someone else. My mother found a lawyer inside of a week and met him at the courthouse the day before he filed." "What happened?" "He filed anyway, and my mother had already filed first." A pause. She knew that once someone like that commits to moving fast, the only thing that stops them is being beaten to the point. Silas sat with that. "Get Webb," Adeline said again. He got up from the table. "Webb," he confirmed at the door. "And eat before you go. You haven't had anything since this morning." He almost said something. She could see the start of it. Some brief, unguarded response that he caught before it came out. He looked at her for a second in the way he had started looking at her sometimes, as if he was working out the distance between where he was and where he meant to be. Then he sat back down, and she put food in front of him. Webb came out the following Thursday. He was a short, methodical man who spoke very little and spent 2 hours walking the fence line of the northern pasture with instruments. Adeline couldn't name, making marks in a field book and occasionally lying flat on the ground to sight along something. She watched from the cookhouse doorway while Nellie prepped the afternoon vegetables inside. Doran came and stood beside her at one point. "You think he'll find what Silas needs?" "I think he'll find what's true," Adeline said. "Whether that's what Silas needs depends on what happened when that fence was built. Silas built it himself 7 years ago, had the survey in hand. Then he should be fine." "Should be," Doran said. "And Dace's man are different things." Webb came in for lunch, just appeared in the cookhouse doorway, and stood there until Adeline waved him to a seat and put a bowl in front of him. He ate without speaking. When he was done, he put a coin on the table. "I don't charge the ranch," she started. "I charge myself," he said. He picked up his hat. "Good soup." "Thank you." "The fence is right," he said at the door. "I'll have the paper by Friday." He left. Adeline stood in the kitchen for a moment. "Is that good?" Nellie asked from the other side of the kitchen. "That's very good," Adeline said. She went back to work. The paper came on Friday, as Webb had promised, and it was exactly what Silas needed. A formal, independent survey with documented reference points that matched the original filing and contradicted Galt's map at the critical measurement by 22 feet in the other direction entirely. Silas came to the kitchen that evening with the paper in his hand. He set it on the table in front of Adeline without saying anything. She read it. "Galt measured from the wrong rock," she said. "Or the right rock," Silas said, "depending on what Dace paid him for." "Has Dace seen this yet?" "He will tomorrow." "And what do you think he'll do?" Silas looked at the paper. "A reasonable man would back down." "Is Dace a reasonable man?" He looked at her. "No." Adeline was quiet for a moment. She looked at the survey document and she thought about the tin box near the cookhouse door and the 2 women from Copper Ridge who had come alone, and the 34 people who had come last Sunday, and the cattle buyer from Fort Worth who had asked if she was available for hire. She thought about the specific kind of man who laughed at things he'd already decided weren't worth worrying about. "He'll push harder," she said. Silas nodded slowly. "That's what I think, too." "Then we should be ready for that." She handed the survey paper back to him. "And before you figure out how to be ready for that, you should know that I have an idea." Silas looked at her with an expression that had, over the past weeks, moved from wariness to something more complicated. "The last idea you had turned into the most talked-about Sunday meal in the county. This one might be harder to explain. Tell me." She told him. He was quiet for a long time after. "That's either very smart," he said finally, "or it's going to make everything worse." "I know." "You're not bothered by that?" Adeline looked at him. "I've been walking into rooms where people decided I didn't belong for most of my adult life, and I'm still here. Being in a situation that might go badly has never stopped me from moving." Silas looked at her, really looked, in the way he had started doing, the way that had nothing to do with assessment and everything to do with something she wasn't ready to name yet. "Okay," he said. "Okay, you'll do it?" "Okay, we'll do it." She nodded once, started clearing the table. "Adeline?" She stopped. "Whatever happens with Dace, the ranch is different since you came. The men are different. Even Rhett." He paused. "I should have said that before now." She stood still for a moment, hands on the dishes she had been stacking. "You're saying it now," she said. She carried the dishes to the basin and started the water. Outside, the cottonwoods were moving in the evening wind, and the cookhouse was warm, and somewhere in the distance, one of the cowboys was playing a badly tuned harmonica that was somehow not entirely unpleasant in the dark. Adeline washed the dishes. She thought about her mother, who had built a place rather than a restaurant. She thought about what it meant to be building something that felt, for the first time in years, like it might last. She didn't let herself think too far ahead. There was Dace to contend with first, and Dace, she was certain, wasn't finished. The idea Adeline had proposed to Silas was simple in its outline and complicated in almost every other way. She had laid it out plainly, without dressing it up, because dressed-up ideas had a way of hiding their own problems until the wrong moment. Dace was going to move on the northern pasture before any state investigation could reach Copper Ridge. He was confident, he was fast, and he had spent months building a paper trail through a county surveyor. He had likely been paying in some form or another since before Webb had ever been contacted. The conventional response, armed cowboys on the fence line, legal filings, a long wait for a circuit judge, gave Dace exactly the terrain he wanted. A range dispute that looked from the outside like two powerful men arguing over 22 feet of ground. What Adeline had proposed instead was to make the dispute impossible to contain privately. "Don't defend the northern pasture quietly," she had told Silas. "Make it the most public piece of ground in the county." The Sunday table had been drawing 30, 35, nearly 40 people in recent weeks. Cattle buyers, merchants, traveling families, ranchers from neighboring properties. The two women from Copper Ridge who had started coming regularly and who had, in the past 2 Sundays, brought 4 other women with them. People who talked, people who formed opinions over good food and came back the following week with those opinions slightly solidified and newly embellished. What she proposed was to move the Sunday table, not cancel it, not shrink it. Move it physically to the northern pasture beside the disputed creek. Set tables in the open air. Cook on portable equipment. Invite everyone who had ever come to Iron Hollow on a Sunday, and make sure word reached the county seat, the circuit judge's circuit, and critically, any independent state surveyors who might find it professionally interesting to be present when a fraudulent survey was publicly examined. Silas had said it was either very smart or it would make everything worse. He was right on both counts, which was exactly why Adeline had waited until she was sure before proposing it. She was sure now. Getting sure had taken 2 weeks. The first of those 2 weeks was spent in conversations that Adeline conducted while cooking, which was her preferred method because it kept her hands busy and gave the other person something to look at besides her face when they said things they weren't certain about. Doran was her first conversation. He came to the kitchen early on a Saturday morning before anyone else was up, the way he did sometimes when he wanted to talk without an audience. "What do you know about Galt?" she asked, before he had fully settled onto the stool at the end of the counter. Doran picked up the coffee she had already poured and thought about it. "County surveyor. Been in the position about 6 years. Before that he worked for Dace's outfit directly, one of the land management people." Adeline's hands didn't stop. So Dace hired him effectively. Not hired him for the county job. Couldn't do that. But someone like Dace, in a county this size, he doesn't need to hire a man officially. He just needs to be the reason things went a certain way for that man at a certain point. And Galt knows what he did with that survey? Doran looked at his coffee. Man doesn't make a measuring error of 22 feet on accident. Not a professional. Not from a different reference point on a flat pasture in good weather. So he knows. He knows. She was quiet for a moment, working the bread dough. Has anyone else noticed, in town I mean, among the people who come on Sundays? Doran tilted his head. There's talk. People know Dace has been pushing on the northern boundary for years. They know about the creek. Most people in cattle country can work out what a reliable water source means in a dry summer. If it were clear in public that the survey was fraudulent, not just argued in a legal filing, but visible in front of people, what would happen to Galt's position? Doran looked at her. He'd lose it. County can't keep a surveyor whose work is publicly wrong on a property line dispute. Too many people have their own land depending on his measurements. And Dace? Dace has got friends in the county seat, but friends in the county seat are friends for as long as your name doesn't become embarrassing. A man who bought a county surveyor to steal a spring-fed creek from a working cattle ranch. He shook his head. That's the kind of story that follows a person. Adeline turned the bread dough. Who do you know at the county seat who isn't Dace's friend? Doran thought for longer this time. Magistrate named Harlow. Old man. Been there since before Dace had any money. He doesn't love Dace, and Dace knows it. Would he listen? He'd listen to evidence. He wouldn't listen to a grievance. I'm not planning to bring a grievance. She covered the bread and moved to the next task. I'm planning to bring 70 people. The second week was preparation, which was where the difference between an idea and an execution lived. Adeline had learned, in kitchens, in boarding houses, in every situation where she had been the person people looked at skeptically before they looked at what she could actually do, that preparation was the only argument that couldn't be interrupted. You couldn't argue with a meal that was already on the table. You couldn't dismiss work that was already done. She told Nellie the plan on a Monday morning. Nellie listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Adeline had come to value about her over the weeks. She had learned to take in information before she responded to it, which was rarer than it should have been. We're cooking outside, Nellie said when Adeline finished. Yes, in March. It won't be the first time anyone's cooked outside in March. What equipment do we have that can travel? They inventoried together. The large cast iron pot could go on a tripod over a fire. She had done that kind of cooking before and it required adjustment, but nothing impossible. The bread was more complicated. She couldn't bake outdoors without a Dutch oven setup, which meant the bread would be different than what people had come to expect, but different and good was manageable if she planned for it. The roasting was the real problem. A proper roast needed sustained, even heat, which a fire in open air did not provide in March wind. We smoke instead of roast, Adeline said. Nellie looked at the smokehouse. For 70 people. We start 3 days early. Nellie was quiet for a moment, calculating. We'd need to run the smokehouse at full capacity from Thursday. Yes. And if it rains? Then we'll be wet. Adeline looked at her. The tables can be covered. The food will be ready regardless of weather. What I can't control is the weather. What I can control is everything else. Nellie nodded slowly. What do you need me to do? I need you to take the counting book and work out what we need in supplies for 70 people, accounting for the smoking time, and then I need that list by tomorrow morning so I can get it to Silas. Nellie took the counting book. She had the list by tomorrow morning. It was thorough and the quantities were nearly right. 2 pounds off on the dried peppers, which Adeline corrected, and slightly underestimated on salt, which she added. You worked this out yourself? Adeline asked. From the ratios we've been using. Adeline looked at the list again. Nellie had not just scaled up the existing recipes. She had adjusted for the different cooking method. Lower salt in the initial stage for smoked meat because the smoke concentrated the seasoning. More fat on the exterior for the same reason. She had noted it in small writing at the margin. Where did you learn that? Adeline asked. Nellie's expression was careful. You said it once, about the first batch of pork belly. I wrote it down that night. Adeline handed the list back. Tell me every time you write something down. I want to know what you're keeping. Silas, for his part, handled the logistical side without complaint, and with an efficiency that Adeline was coming to understand was simply how he operated when he had committed to something. He didn't second-guess decisions he had already made. He organized the transport of the tables, 4 long planks that disassembled, and arranged for the extra wood supply, and he sent word through the channels that word traveled in cattle country, which were the same channels information had always traveled, trading posts, feed stores, the men who rode between ranches carrying mail and small parcels, and 3 times as much spoken news. He also sent a personal note to Magistrate Harlowe. Adeline had asked him to. She had told him what to put in it, not an accusation, not a legal argument, just an invitation to Sunday dinner on the northern pasture of Iron Hollow Ranch, with the observation that a question of survey methodology would be discussed in the presence of an independent assessment, and that the magistrate's presence would be welcomed as a witness to whatever that assessment revealed. That's a careful way to say what I'm actually saying, Silas observed. Harlow's an old man with a long memory and a dislike of being rushed, Adeline said. Careful is the right speed. Silas wrote the note the way she suggested. The response came back in 2 days. A brief, formal acknowledgement that said the magistrate would attend if health permitted, and that he had asked his associate, a state property assessor named Drummond, to accompany him. Adeline read that response twice. A state property assessor was significantly better than a magistrate alone. A state assessor had the authority to formally invalidate a county survey on grounds of methodological error. She put the note down, went back to the kitchen, started the Thursday smokehouse. Thursday through Saturday were the hardest work she had done at Iron Hollow. The smokehouse ran continuously, which required someone awake at all hours to manage the wood. Adeline took the overnight shifts herself, midnight to 4 in the morning, out in the cold with the smokehouse fire, drinking bad coffee she made on the cookhouse stove, and carrying it out in a covered tin. Nellie took the early morning shift, 4 to 7. Doran, who seemed to exist partly outside normal human sleep requirements, took 11 to midnight without being asked. You don't have to do that, Adeline told him when she found him there the first night. No, he agreed. Then why? Because whatever you're building here is the first thing at this ranch worth building in a while. He said it without sentimentality, just as a fact. Go sleep. I'll watch it. She slept. 3 hours, which was not enough and was what was available. The Friday supply delivery was short on hickory chips. The trading post in town had sent oak, which was adequate, but she had been planning for hickory. She adjusted the timing and the temperature accordingly. The oak was going to give the meat a slightly different character. She decided it was fine, possibly better. Oak smoke was cleaner and didn't argue with the pepper rub the way hickory sometimes did. Saturday, she and Nellie prepped everything that could be prepped. The bean pots, the cornbread batter that would cook in Dutch ovens, the apple preserve she had been putting up since February. The coffee supply for what she estimated would be a great deal of coffee because people standing around in March whined in a pasture needed something warm in their hands to keep them feeling civil. By Saturday evening, she had done everything she could do. She sat on the back step of the cookhouse in the cooling dark and felt the specific tiredness that came after maximum preparation. Not the desperate tiredness of running out of time, but the settled tiredness of having done the work. Silas came out and sat on the step beside her. Not close, just beside her, the way two people sat when they had been working toward the same thing and were both temporarily done. "You think he'll come?" she asked. She didn't have to say who. "Dace?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "He'll know something is happening. Man like Dace always knows when something is moving, whether he comes himself or sends someone. He'll be there in some form. If he sends men, then we deal with men." Silas looked at the dark pasture to the north. "If he comes himself, it's worse." "It's better," Adeline said. He looked at her. "If he sends riders, they can escalate without authorization. They can make their own decisions. If Dace is there himself, the decision to escalate has to go through him. And Dace is a man who has always operated on intimidation rather than direct action. He's never had to actually fight for anything. He just had to look like he would." Silas considered this. "You've thought about him a lot." "I've thought about the situation. He's part of the situation." A beat. "How are you so calm about this?" Adeline looked out at the same dark pasture. "I'm not calm. I'm tired, and I've done everything I can do, and the part I can't control hasn't happened yet. That's not calm. That's just where I am right now." Silas was quiet. "When my mother was fighting for the restaurant lease," Adeline said, "she couldn't sleep the night before the courthouse. She sat in the kitchen all night, not cooking, just sitting. My father kept asking her to come to bed, and she kept saying she would in a minute." A pause. "She was running through every mistake she might have made, every document, every argument the other man's lawyer might use. Was she right to worry? Worry? She was always right to worry. Worry was how she stayed ahead of things." Adeline looked at her own hands in her lap. "But she went to the courthouse in the morning, and she filed first, and she won. Not because worrying helped, because the work she did while she was worrying was right." Silas didn't say anything for a while. Then, "I used to do that with the ranch accounts, after Martha died. Sit up with the ledgers, not because I needed to check them, just because sitting with numbers felt like doing something." She understood that, the comfort of accountable things when the unaccountable ones pressed too hard. "Did it help?" she asked. "Mostly it just told me what I already knew." He shifted his weight slightly. "She would have liked you, I think. Martha." The statement arrived quietly, without preamble or setup. Adeline looked at him sideways. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the dark line of cottonwoods at the far edge of the north pasture. "You don't have to say things like that," she said. "I'm not saying it because I have to." He was still looking at the trees. "I'm saying it because it's true, and I've been not saying true things for too long." She sat with that for a moment. She liked people who did what they said and said what they did, he continued. She had very little patience for people who wrapped things up nicely to avoid saying what they meant. "She sounds like someone worth knowing." "She was." He paused. "You remind me of her sometimes. Not in how you look, in how you move through a room, like you've already decided where you're going." Adeline looked at the dark again. "I don't always know where I'm going. Nobody does. That's not what I meant." He finally looked at her. "I meant you move like someone who's made peace with not knowing and decided to move anyway." She didn't have an answer for that. She didn't think he needed one. They sat in the dark for a while longer, and the cottonwoods moved in the night wind, and the smokehouse behind them breathed its slow, fragrant breath, and eventually they both went inside. Sunday arrived gray and cold with a wind out of the northwest that nobody had planned for. Adeline was up at 4. She and Nellie had the Dutch ovens going by 5:30, the tripod fire built and managed, the smoked meat checked and found to be exactly what it should be. And she had stood in the smokehouse doorway for a moment in the dark, with the smell of oak smoke and spiced pork around her, and thought, this part is right. The wind was the problem. Not insurmountable. A sustained northwest wind meant the fire had to be positioned differently, and the Dutch ovens needed windbreaks, which meant they were slower, which meant the timing shifted. She adjusted. She told Nellie to put the bean pots on first instead of the cornbread, because beans could hold and cornbread couldn't. She recalculated the sequence in her head while her hands were doing other things, which was a skill her mother had taught her, and she had never stopped practicing. Silas and 4 ranch hands had the tables erected on the northern pasture by 8 in the morning. Long plank tables, bare wood, set close to the disputed creek where the original survey markers, old iron stakes driven into the ground 7 years ago when the fence was built, were visible in the winter-brown grass. She looked at the tables from a distance. They looked exactly like what they were, a meal laid out in an open field. And somehow, for that reason, they also looked like a statement. Doran appeared beside her. 42 confirmed coming, maybe more. More will come when they see the smoke from the road. He looked at her. You planned for that. I planned for the smoke to be visible from the main road, yes. He almost smiled. He rarely actually smiled. How? Greenwood added to the outer edge of the fire, just enough. It burns slower and makes a column. She picked up a pot. It's an old trick. My father used it when he wanted people to know the restaurant was open. They came. Not all at once, in the rolling, staggered way that Sunday arrivals always came. Families and single riders and pairs of men on horseback. Some of them familiar faces from previous Sundays, some of them new, some of them clearly brought by curiosity rather than hunger, though the hunger caught up with them soon enough. 42 became 51 became, by 11 in the morning, what Adeline estimated at between 65 and 70 people occupying the long tables and the surrounding grass, some of them standing with plates because the seating had filled. Magistrate Harlowe arrived at 10:30 in a buggy driven by a younger man, and beside him sat someone Adeline did not know. A compact, precise-looking man in his 40s with a leather case across his knees and the particular quality of stillness that came from a man who had spent his career looking very carefully at things. Drummond, the state property assessor. Silas met them at the pasture gate and shook hands and brought them toward the tables, and Adeline watched from the fire while Nellie managed the cornbread. Is that the assessor? Nellie asked without looking up. How do you know about Drummond? Doran told me. Nellie turned the Dutch oven lid. He said if Drummond shows up, it means the state is already interested. When did Doran tell you this? Yesterday morning, when you were in the smokehouse. Adeline filed that away. Doran was keeping Nellie informed, which meant he had decided Nellie was worth keeping informed, which was a different assessment than anyone at Iron Hollow had made about the girl before. It means the state is paying attention, she said. That's what matters. Drummond, for his part, did not eat immediately. He set his leather case on the end of a table, opened it, and spent the first 20 minutes walking the fence line with Webb's survey documentation in one hand and a measuring instrument in the other, moving methodically through the winter grass while the gathered crowd watched from varying distances with the kind of interested restraint people applied to situations they understood were significant. He measured from the original iron stakes. He measured again. He made notes. He walked to where Galt's reference point was marked on the disputed survey, a secondary rock formation about 40 yards from the creek, and stood looking at it for a long time. Then he walked back to Silas. The original stakes are consistent with the 1876 filing, he said, loud enough that the nearest 20 people could hear. He did not appear to be lowering his voice intentionally. He appeared to be a man who spoke at a normal volume and expected to be heard. The reference point in the county survey dated last October is not consistent with any established natural landmark in the original filing. The discrepancy of 22 feet is directionally consistent with relocating the effective property line to a position that would exclude this creek from Iron Hollow's boundary. Magistrate Harlowe, sitting at the nearest table with a plate in front of him that he had barely touched, said, "You're saying the county survey is wrong." I'm saying the county survey used a reference point that doesn't appear in the original filing, and that produces a result favorable to one party in a disputed boundary claim. Drummond closed his case. Whether that's error or intent is a question for other proceedings. Methodologically, the original survey stands. The crowd was very quiet. Not entirely quiet. There was the wind and the fire and the sound of 60-something people breathing. But the particular quality of silence that meant everyone present had just understood something and was absorbing it. Adeline was plating the smoked meat when she heard the horses. She heard them before she saw them because the wind was carrying sound from the north, and horses coming fast from the north were loud before they were visible. She looked up. Dace rode in through the far pasture gate with 6 men at his back. He had come himself. She had thought he might send riders. She had prepared for that. She had also prepared for this, though preparation and reality had a gap between them that you only discovered when reality arrived. He looked at the tables, at the 65 or 70 people, at the magistrate and the man with the leather case. Something moved through his face. She was too far to read it precisely, but she could read the shape of it. Surprise that was converting rapidly into anger, because anger was the only response available to a man who had expected to find 20 cowboys and found 65 witnesses instead. He rode to where Silas was standing near the tables. "What is this?" he said. "Sunday dinner," Silas said. "I'm here to discuss the boundary claim." "Then you can discuss it here." Silas gestured mildly toward the crowd and toward Drummond. "Mr. Drummond from the State Assessor's Office has just completed his examination of the original survey stakes. You're welcome to hear his findings." Dace looked at Drummond. Drummond looked at Dace without any particular expression. "The original Iron Hollow survey holds," Drummond said. "I'll be filing a formal assessment with the State Land Office by end of week." The wind moved through the pasture grass. Dace's jaw tightened. He looked around at the tables, at the merchants from Copper Ridge, at the cattle buyers who he had done business with, at Magistrate Harlowe sitting with a fork he had finally picked up, at all the accumulated faces of people who would carry what they had seen today back to every corner of the county. "This isn't finished," he said to Silas. "It's close to finished," Silas said, "unless you want to argue with a state assessor in front of 60 witnesses." Dace looked at the 6 men he had brought. Then he looked at the crowd again. Then he looked at something Adeline had not expected him to look at. He looked at her. Standing at the fire with a serving ladle, a full figure in a work dress with her hair pulled back and soot on her apron from the fire, completely still, meeting his eyes without expression. She did not look away. He was the first to break it. He looked back at Silas. "You had help." Silas said nothing. "That cook of yours." His voice had something in it that wasn't quite contempt anymore. It was something else, something that happened when a man who had dismissed something discovered it had been the thing that undid him. "You had a cook helping you." "I had a partner," Silas said quietly. Dace turned his horse. He had gotten 3 steps when Adeline spoke. She didn't plan it. It arrived in her the way things arrived when she had been holding them long enough, not impulsively, but completely. "Mr. Dace." He stopped. The crowd around the tables was very still. No piece of land is worth dying over when the truth is already standing here in front of 70 witnesses. Dace sat on his horse. He did not turn all the way around. He turned just enough for her to see the side of his face. "That creek would have been worth a great deal," he said. "To you," she said. "It already belongs to someone else." His jaw moved. He looked forward again. He put his heels to the horse and rode through the gate. His 6 riders looked at each other. Then, one by one, they followed him out. Nobody at the tables moved for a full 10 seconds. Then the man closest to Adeline, a cattleman named Briggs, who had been coming to Sunday dinners since the 3rd week and always ate 2 servings, picked up his fork. "Is there more of that smoked pork?" he asked. "There is," Adeline said. She went back to the fire. Nellie was watching her with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not entirely succeeding. "You planned for that?" Nellie asked. "I planned for him to come. I didn't plan what I said." She picked up the ladle. "Plate up. People are still hungry." Nellie plated. The wind had eased, or maybe she had just stopped noticing it. Silas came to the fire 10 minutes later when the crowd had resumed the particular sound of people eating and talking after something tense had resolved. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking, which was a thing he did when he was processing and didn't want to say anything until he had processed it properly. "Drummond's filing on Friday," he finally said. "I heard him. Harlowe's going to open a formal inquiry into Galt's survey methodology." "Good." There are 4 men from the county land office over there who drove out this morning specifically because they heard something official was happening. They're witnesses. Adeline looked. She identified them. Formal-looking men who were eating slightly self-consciously, as if they weren't quite sure whether eating at this table put them in some kind of implicit alignment with one party in the dispute. Make sure someone takes their plates around again, she said. People who feel fed are more comfortable than people who feel awkward. Silas looked at her sideways. Is that how you think about hospitality? As a tool? I think about it as what it actually is, she said, which is making people feel like they belong somewhere long enough for something real to happen. He was quiet. That's what my mother built, she said. Not a restaurant, that. She handed the ladle to Nellie and went to check the bean pots, which needed another 20 minutes and were sitting correctly and required no adjustment. She stood over them for a moment with the wind on her back and the smell of oak smoke in her coat. 67 people on a disputed piece of ground, eating food she had been building toward since Thursday, and a man who had laughed at her in this same pasture 2 months ago had just ridden away without a single shot fired. She thought about her mother sitting in the kitchen all night before the courthouse. She thought, I understand that now. She went back to work. Drummond filed his assessment on Friday, as he had said he would. The document reached the state land office in Austin by the following Tuesday, and by Wednesday of that same week, a formal notice of survey irregularity had been issued to Galt's office. Not a dismissal yet, not a criminal finding, but the kind of official letter that a county surveyor receiving it would understand meant his professional standing was now under examination, and that every measurement he had made in the past 6 years was potentially subject to review. Doran brought the news from town. He came into the kitchen at mid-morning, poured himself coffee without being invited, which he had earned the right to do by now, and sat at the end of the counter. Galt's not coming into the feed store anymore, he said. Apparently he's been avoiding the main street. Adeline was working dough. Is he still in the county seat? Still there, but quieter. Doran drank his coffee. Word is Dace went to see him the day after the assessor's notice arrived. Nobody knows what was said. What do you think was said? I think Dace told him to hold the line, and I think Galt is working out whether holding the line is worth what happens to him professionally when this finishes. It's already finishing, Adeline said. Dace doesn't think so. She looked up from the dough. What's he doing? Filing a counter-petition with the state land office, citing procedural error in how Webb's survey was conducted, claiming the original iron stakes were moved at some point after the first filing. Adeline's hands stopped. He's claiming Silas moved the stakes. Not directly. Claiming they may have shifted due to frost heave or deliberate relocation. Doran's expression was flat. It's a slow-down tactic. Even if it fails, it puts the filing in dispute long enough for Dace to… Long enough for what? Long enough to have someone occupy the pasture before the state can act. Doran set down his cup. He doesn't need to win the legal argument. He needs to create enough confusion that the state backs off a definitive ruling while he puts cattle on that creek. Adeline went back to the dough. Her hands were working, but her mind was somewhere else, running the same calculation she had run before the Sunday dinner, looking for the move that was 2 steps ahead of the obvious one. When does he have to file the counter-petition? It's already filed, 2 days ago. Silas got notice this morning. Where's Silas now? Main house. He's been there since the notice came. She covered the dough and washed her hands. She told Nellie to watch the bread and walked to the main house. Silas was at his desk with papers spread in front of him, which was how she had found him twice before in difficult moments, using the physical act of organizing documents as a way to impose order on a situation that was resisting order. He was not a man who paced. He was a man who sat and laid things out and stared at them until they gave him something. He looked up when she came in. You heard, he said. Doran told me. Dace is claiming the stakes were moved. I know. It's not true. I know that too. She sat down across the desk. What does your lawyer say? Lawyer in Harrison County. He says the counter-petition is thin. There's no evidence the stakes were moved, and frost heave doesn't produce a directional shift of 22 feet in a consistent measurement, which any competent engineer can testify to. But the legal process takes time. Months, possibly longer if Dace's attorney argues for additional review. Silas pressed his hands flat on the desk. Meanwhile, Dace can move cattle onto the creek pasture and claim he's operating under the original disputed survey while the case is unresolved. By the time the state rules definitively, he's established a pattern of use. Adeline was quiet for a moment. Has he moved cattle yet? Not yet. Then there's still time. Time for what? There was an edge in his voice, not at her, but at the situation, the frustration of a man who had done everything right and was watching it not be enough. We filed, Webb's filed, Drummond's filed. Dace's attorney is slowing everything down, and I cannot put armed men on that fence line without it turning into something the state uses against me. No, she agreed. You can't. He looked at her. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that Dace's move only works if nobody's watching. She looked at the papers on his desk. The Sunday dinner worked because it made the dispute visible. Visible disputes are harder to manipulate than private ones. We can't do another Sunday dinner every week. No, but we can make sure that every person who came to that dinner knows what Dace filed and why. She leaned forward slightly. Who in that crowd has land that Galt surveyed? Silas thought. Several. Briggs has had Galt out twice. The Morrison family. They used him for their boundary with the Cutter property. Old Henderson, probably. If Galt's survey methodology is under state review, their boundaries are potentially compromised too. Silas was very still. That's not a small thing to put in people's heads. It's already in people's heads, Adeline said. The minute Drummond filed, anyone who's used Galt in the past 6 years started thinking about it. I'm not suggesting we frighten anyone. I'm suggesting that Dace's tactic of legal delay only works in isolation. It doesn't work when 20 landowners are collectively paying attention to the same state proceeding. Silas sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at her. You want to write letters? I want you to write letters, from you to your neighbors, not about your dispute specifically, about the state review of Galt's methodology and what it might mean for anyone who has property lines established by his measurements. That's... He stopped. It's information, Adeline said. That's all it is. He looked at her for a long time, the kind of looking that had become familiar over the past weeks. Not assessment, not calculation, something more direct than either of those things, and less defined. Where did you learn to think like this, he said. It wasn't quite the same question he had asked before. There was something different in the asking this time. Same place I learned to cook, she said, from watching my mother do it first. He picked up his pen. He wrote 12 letters that afternoon. Adeline sat at the far end of the desk and worked on the week's supply accounting, and neither of them talked much, and the fire in the hearth burned steadily, and by the time the light outside the window had gone from afternoon gold to early evening gray, the letters were done and addressed. I'll have Doran ride them out tomorrow, Silas said. Send 2 men. Cover more ground faster. He nodded. He set the pen down and stretched his hands the way a person did after writing for several hours. And for a moment he just sat across from her in the lamplight, not doing anything, which was unusual enough for him that she noticed it. Thank you, he said. I didn't write the letters. You wrote them. He looked at her directly. I put pen to paper. That's not the same thing. She closed her ledger. Don't give me more than I'm owed. I'm not sure I can give you what you're actually owed, he said. I'm not sure there's a number for it. She looked at him. He wasn't being careless with the words. She could tell that. He was saying something specific, and the specificity of it had a weight she felt in her chest, not unpleasantly, but in the way of something that required careful handling. Let's see how Dace responds to the letters first, she said. She got up and went back to the kitchen. Dace responded in a way nobody had anticipated, which was by not responding at all for 2 weeks. In another situation, silence from Bramwell Dace might have meant retreat. In this situation, it meant something else, which Adeline understood by the 3rd day of quiet and confirmed by the end of the 1st week. Dace had changed his approach entirely. He had stopped fighting the legal proceeding and started working on the county commissioners. There were 3 commissioners in Copper Ridge County. 2 of them had been elected with significant financial support from Dace's outfit. The 3rd, an older man named Cowboy, who ran a small farm at the county's western edge, had no such relationship with Dace and had, in fact, been in a quiet property dispute with him over a road access easement for the better part of 4 years. What Dace was attempting was to get the two commissioners he controlled to pass a county resolution acknowledging his surveyor's original filing as the operative document for boundary purposes, pending state review. It wouldn't override the state assessor's finding, but it would create a competing county-level record that his attorney could use to further delay the state proceeding. Adeline learned about this from an unexpected source. The dark-haired woman from Copper Ridge, the one who had come alone on that second Sunday, and whose name, Adeline had eventually learned, was Clara Marsh, appeared at the cookhouse door on a Thursday afternoon with a basket over one arm and a look on her face that combined urgency with the careful dignity of someone who didn't want to appear to be alarming. "I need to speak to you," she said. "Not to Mr. Creed first, to you." Adeline brought her inside. Clara Marsh was 34 years old. She ran the dry goods store in Copper Ridge that her husband had owned before he died 2 years earlier, of a heart that gave out without warning. She had 2 children in school and a business that turned a modest profit when she worked it right, and a fragile margin when she didn't. She had been coming to Sunday dinners for 6 weeks and had, in that time, moved from the careful posture of someone testing whether she was welcome to the more relaxed posture of someone who had decided she was. She put her basket on the table and said, "My neighbor's husband is on the county commission, Commissioner Tillis." Adeline poured coffee and sat down across from her. "He told her, and she told me, because we've known each other 20 years, that Dace's attorney came to see Tillis and Commissioner Pratt on Monday. He's asking them to pass a resolution at the next commission meeting, Thursday next week." "What kind of resolution?" Clara told her. Adeline sat with it for a moment. "If that resolution passes, Dace's attorney uses it to file for a stay of the state proceeding. That's what my neighbor's husband said." Clara wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "I don't know if that's right legally. I'm not a lawyer." "It sounds right," Adeline said, "or close enough to do damage." "Can Silas stop it?" "Silas can't stop the commission from voting, but—" She stopped. Thought. "What's the quorum requirement for a commission resolution?" Clara blinked. I don't know." "Does Commissioner Calloway know about this meeting?" "I don't know that either." Adeline stood up. "Thank you for coming. This matters. You did the right thing." Clara looked at her with an expression that carried something underneath it, not just the urgency of the message she had delivered, but something about the act of delivering it, of crossing the several miles from town to a ranch, to bring information to a woman she had met 6 weeks ago over smoked pork and cornbread. "Are you going to be able to do something about it?" she asked. Adeline looked at her. "I'm going to try. That's all I can promise you." Clara nodded. She picked up her basket. At the door, she paused. "The other women, the ones who have been coming on Sundays, they know something's happening with Dace. They talk about it." Another pause. "If you need people present at a county commission meeting, they'd come. Most of them have business in town on Thursdays anyway." She left. Adeline stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she went to find Silas. Silas sent a rider to Calloway that same afternoon. The response came back the next morning. Calloway had not been notified of any special commission meeting for Thursday. The standard meeting schedule showed nothing until the regular session 3 weeks out. Whatever Tillis and Pratt were planning, they were planning it as a special session that could be called with 48 hours' notice under the county charter, which meant they could do it legally and quickly, and Calloway could not prevent the meeting from being called. What Calloway could do was attend. And what attending meant, Silas's lawyer confirmed in a letter that arrived by Friday's post, was that a resolution passed over a dissenting commissioner's objection carried a different weight than a unanimous resolution. It wasn't a veto, but it was a formal record of dissent that could be entered into the state proceeding as evidence that the county action was contested, which materially weakened its value as a supporting document for Dace's stay request. "So we need Calloway in that room," Silas said. "He's already planning to be in that room," Adeline said. "We need people in the seats behind him." Witnesses. People with business before the county commission. People who have property surveyed by Galt. People who have a professional or commercial stake in how this county handles a challenge survey. She looked at him. "People who come to Sunday dinner." Silas rubbed his jaw. He had the look he got when he was computing risk, not avoiding it, just measuring it accurately before he committed. "If I ask people to attend a county commission meeting on my behalf, don't ask them on your behalf. Ask them to attend a public meeting about a county surveyor whose work is under state review." She sat across from him. Every one of those people has a reason to be there that isn't you. Their own land, their own boundaries, their own commercial interests. You're not asking for a favor. You're making sure they know the meeting is happening. He was quiet. The letters you sent last week, she said. Did anyone respond? 4. Briggs sent a note, Henderson, 2 others. Positive? Concerned, which is the appropriate response to learning. The man who surveyed your property boundary is under state review. Then they're already engaged, Adeline said. You're not building something from scratch. You're telling people the time and the place. Silas looked at her across the desk. You should be in that room too, he said. She shook her head. I'm not the right person to be in that room. You're the one who... I'm a cook from Iron Hollow Ranch who has been here 4 months. The right people in that room are the county landowners and the merchants and the people whose lives are affected by how this county maintains its official records. She was direct about it, not apologetic. My being there makes it about me and Dace and that Sunday on the pasture. The people being there makes it about the county. He considered that. She could tell he didn't entirely agree or didn't entirely like it, but he understood it. All right, he said. The letters went out Saturday. Not 12 this time. 19. Silas wrote them, and Adeline addressed the envelopes because his handwriting on addresses was functional but slow, and they needed them out before Sunday. Clara Marsh received one. So did 8 other women, which was Adeline's addition to the list when Silas had gone over it with her. He had listed landowners and merchants, which was right. She added the women who ran businesses, who kept household accounts, who made purchasing decisions that merchants depended on, and who represented a category of interested party that the county commission would not expect to see in their seats on a Thursday morning. They might not come, Silas said, looking at the additions. Some won't, some will. She sealed the last envelope. Men like Tillis assume women don't attend commission meetings. That assumption is part of what makes a room full of them effective. He looked at her. That's a cold way to think about it, he said. Not critically, just observing. It's an accurate way, she said. I'd rather be accurate and useful than comfortable and wrong. Thursday came. Adeline was at the smokehouse at 5 in the morning because the work of the ranch did not stop for county politics, and whatever happened in the commission room in Copper Ridge was beyond the reach of her hands. She had done what she could do. The rest was Silas's to manage, and Calloway's, and the 20 or so people who had received letters and might or might not show up. She worked the morning. Nellie knew something was happening. She had figured out most of the situation through the combination of paying attention and Doran's continuing practice of keeping her informed. But she didn't ask questions about things she understood Adeline couldn't answer yet. She worked. They worked together. The kitchen moved through its morning the way the kitchen always moved, because the men still needed feeding, and the smokehouse still needed tending, and the bread still needed to rise and be punched down and rise again. Doran left for town at 7:30. He came back at 2 in the afternoon. Adeline heard the horse and kept working. She heard him come into the cookhouse. She heard him sit down on the stool. She put the ladle down and turned around. His expression wasn't the flat, contained look he wore for neutral information. It was something slightly different. The resolution failed, he said. She let out a breath she had been partially holding for a week. Calloway moved an amendment to table the resolution pending completion of the state survey review. The motion to table required only a simple majority. Calloway voted yes, Tillis and Pratt voted no. Tie. A tie doesn't table it. No, but there were 31 people in the public seats. Doran paused. Which is about 30 more than a special commission session usually draws. Tillis looked out at them and moved to postpone the vote to the regular session. He backed down. He said he wanted additional review time, which means he looked at 31 people who were not supposed to be there and decided the resolution wasn't worth the visibility. Adeline turned back to the stove. She adjusted the pot that didn't need adjusting. Silas? She asked. He's fine. He spoke briefly before the session, on the record, just stated Iron Hollow's position and entered Webb's documentation and the Drummond assessment into the public record. Clean. A pause. Calloway backed him up. And the women? Something shifted in Doran's expression, a movement that was closer to actual emotion than his face usually permitted. Clara Marsh stood up during the public comment period. So did 3 others. They asked the commission to clarify what obligations it had to landowners who had relied on Golt's measurements for property planning. Tillis had no good answer. He drank his coffee. People pay more attention when it's a woman asking a question he can't answer, different than a man asking it. He can't dismiss it the same way. Adeline was quiet. "Duran," she said. "Yeah. Tell Nellie, she's been worried." He got up and went to find Nellie without another word. Silas came back from town at 4. He came into the kitchen and sat at the end of the table and looked at her working for a moment before he said anything. "You heard. Doran told me. Tillis will try again at the regular session. 3 weeks. Then we'll be ready for the regular session." Silas put his elbows on the table. He was tired. She could see it, the specific tired of a man who had been at a high level of sustained alertness for weeks without a break. "This doesn't end with Tillis backing down today." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't end until Dace decides it's cost him more than it's worth." "When is that?" She thought about it honestly. When his political relationships start costing him more than they're giving him. When Tillis and Pratt see him as a liability. When the merchants and the ranchers who've been doing business with him work out that being associated with a fraudulent survey is bad for their own standing. And the Sunday dinners help with that. The Sunday dinners make Iron Hollow a place people feel connected to. People fight for things they feel connected to. They don't fight for strangers. Silas was quiet for a moment. "You did that intentionally," he said, "from the beginning." She looked at him. "I did it because it was the right way to run a kitchen. What it became was—" She paused. "I saw what it could become. Yes." He looked at her steadily. "And this? This whole situation with Dace? Is this what you saw when you proposed the Sunday dinners?" "I saw that Iron Hollow needed to become something people cared about beyond its cattle production. The Dace situation." She shook her head. "I didn't predict Dace, but I knew the pattern. A ranch that nobody feels connected to is easier to isolate. A ranch that 31 people show up in a county commission meeting for is harder to move against." Silas looked at the table. "I've been running this ranch wrong," he said. "You've been running it like a rancher. There's nothing wrong with that. I've been running it like the only thing that matters is the cattle and the land." He looked up. "You've been showing me for 4 months that the cattle and the land only hold if the people around them care about what's on them." She didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about her mother again, about the difference between a restaurant and a place, about the 30 years her parents had spent building something that a fire could take the building of, but not the truth of, because the truth of it was in the recipes in the tin box and in the way Adeline still cooked, still thought, still moved through a kitchen with the certainty of someone who had learned from people who cared about the right things. "My mother would have liked this ranch," she said, "under different management." Silas looked at her. "Under yours, you mean?" "I mean under management that understood what it was actually building." A pause. "Adeline." She looked at him. He had the look of a man who was about to say something he had been working up to for some time, and who had decided in the way that deliberate men eventually decided things, that the working up period was over. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to take your time with it before you answer." She set the ladle down. "All right. What you've built here, say, the Sunday table, the kitchen, what happened today with the commission, all of it. It isn't work for hire. You know that." "I know that. What I've been paying you doesn't cover what you've actually done." "I've been paid what we agreed." "I know. And the agreement was wrong. Not wrong of you. Wrong of me, because I didn't understand what I was getting." He leaned forward. "I want to make it right." She looked at him carefully. "What does making it right look like?" He reached across the desk to the side table where he had set a paper down when he came in. He slid it across to her. She looked at it. It was a legal document, not complete, a draft, with spaces still to be filled. But the structure of it was clear. She read it twice. "You're offering me ownership," she said. "I'm offering you what you've built. The dining operation. The Sunday table. What it's becoming, whatever it will be. I want it to be yours legally, not employed by me, owned by you. Co-ownership of the property it operates on, documented and filed." She looked at the paper for a long time. "Why?" she said. Not suspicion, a real question. "Because a woman who walked 8 miles in winter cold with 50 cents in her bag and asked for one supper to prove herself doesn't deserve to spend the rest of her life working as a hired cook on someone else's property." He said it simply. "And because what's happened here is not mine. It's yours. I was the land. You were the thing that grew on it. She sat back. The paper was in front of her and the kitchen was warm, and she could hear Nellie moving somewhere in the back. And outside the window, the cottonwoods were losing their last winter bare look, and beginning, in the barely visible way of early spring, to suggest that they intended to have leaves again. There's something, she said. She wasn't sure how she knew, but she knew. Silas looked at her directly. Yes. Say it. He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, just finding the right shape for something that mattered enough to get right. The documents are what's right regardless of anything else, he said. That's not contingent. The kitchen, the ownership, the legal standing, that's yours because you earned it, and it's what's fair. But I'd be lying if I told you it was only about what's fair. He met her eyes. I'd be lying if I told you I don't come to this kitchen at 7 every morning because the bread is good. She looked at him. The bread is good, she said. The bread is extraordinary. A beat. That's not why I come. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the cottonwoods moved in the early spring wind, and the smokehouse breathed its slow breath. And somewhere in the county, a man named Dace was recalculating what things were worth. And in the commission room in Copper Ridge, 31 people's presence was still sitting on the record where Clara Marsh had stood up and asked a question nobody had a good answer to. Adeline looked at the legal paper on the table. She looked at Silas. I'll read this properly tonight, she said. Take all the time you need. And tomorrow, she picked up the ladle again. We're talking about the regular session, 3 weeks. I have ideas. Silas sat back. Something in his face had relaxed slightly, not because the answer he'd been hoping for had come, but because the conversation was continuing. For a man like Silas, that was enough for now. I don't doubt it, he said. She went back to the stove. She stood over the pot for a moment with the heat rising around her and the paper on the table behind her, and she thought about what it would mean to own something. Not to work in it, not to be employed by it, but to have her name on paper and the paper filed and the thing she had built actually, legally, permanently hers. She had not let herself think about that possibility in 4 months. She let herself think about it now, for a moment, while the stew moved slowly in the pot, and the kitchen smelled like everything she knew how to do. Then she put the thought away because the men would be in for supper in an hour, and the bread needed to come out in 6 minutes, and there was work to do. There was always work to do. She had never minded that. She read the legal document that night. She sat at the small table in the back of the cookhouse after Nellie had gone to sleep, with the lamp turned up and the paper flat in front of her, and she read it twice through from the first line to the last, the way her mother had taught her to read anything that mattered, not looking for what you hoped was there, but looking for what was actually there. What was actually there was straightforward. Silas was proposing a legal partition of the dining operation from the ranch's cattle business. The Sunday table and whatever it became, the building, the equipment, the commercial operation, would be established as a separate entity with Adeline holding 50% ownership and Silas holding 50% of the land it sat on, which resolved the question of how a cook with no capital acquired property by making the property contribution his and the operational contribution hers, valued equally. It was not a gift. That was the part she kept coming back to, reading and rereading the language of the draft. It was structured as a recognition of contributed value. Her 4 months of work, the Sunday table's revenue, the relationships she had built, the situation with Dace that had been resolved in Iron Hollow's favor partly because of what she had constructed. All of it was being quantified, in legal terms, as equity. Her mother would have recognized the structure immediately. Her mother would also have told her to get a lawyer to read it before she signed anything, which was advice Adeline intended to follow. She folded the paper, put it in the tin box beside the recipes, not inside with them, just beside, because it wasn't the same kind of document, but it belonged in the same proximity, and went to sleep. The 3 weeks before the regular commission session were the most complicated of the 5 months Adeline had been at Iron Hollow, and they were complicated in a direction she hadn't fully anticipated. Dace went quiet again. Not the quiet of retreat. She had learned to distinguish between his silences by now, the way you learn to read the specific quality of a fire by how it burned, rather than just whether it was burning. This was the quiet of a man who had changed terrain without announcing it. What he changed to was money, not bribes, or not directly. More subtle than that. He began calling in favors with every merchant and businessman in Copper Ridge County who owed him something, which, after 15 years of operating as the largest cattle operation in the region, was a significant number of people. He called in debts and markers and the accumulated weight of business relationships conducted over time in ways that left people obligated without any specific transaction to point to. Doran brought this news in pieces, the way he always brought news, sitting at the end of the counter, coffee in hand, stating facts without editorializing. Briggs got a visit from Dace's man, he said, one morning in the second week. Not threatening, just a reminder that Dace's outfit buys 300 head from Briggs every spring. Adeline kept working. What did Briggs say? Said he appreciated the relationship and looked forward to continuing it. Doran paused. But he also said he'd already signed a statement for Webb's documentation, couldn't unsign it. So Dace is trying to isolate the people who've already committed and warn off the ones who haven't. Doran drank his coffee. The Henderson family got a similar visit, and two of the merchants. Clara Marsh? Not yet. Her store doesn't do enough volume with Dace to be worth the conversation. Adeline thought. He's not going to win the state proceeding, he knows that. Drummond's assessment is already filed and it's solid. He doesn't need to win the state proceeding, Doran said. He needs to make sure that when he loses it, he doesn't lose anything else with it. If he can keep enough of his commercial relationships intact, he walks away from the failed survey claim and goes back to business as usual. A pause. That's why the commission resolution still matters. Even if it doesn't change the state outcome, getting it on the county record gives him something to point to, a face-saving document. Adeline was quiet. The thing she was understanding, more clearly now than she had before, was that Dace's endgame wasn't Iron Hollow's land anymore. He had lost that. Or rather, he had failed to take it, which amounted to the same thing. What he was protecting now was his standing, his position as the man in Copper Ridge County whose weight could not be moved. If that position collapsed, everything built on top of it collapsed with it. She understood that kind of structure because she had watched her family's dishonest relative do the same thing after the fire, not trying to hold the actual property anymore because the property was gone, but trying to hold the appearance of being the kind of man who deserved to have had it. Appearance and substance were related but not the same. She had spent her adult life being on the wrong side of appearance and surviving it by making substance do the work. She went to find Silas. "We're not fighting the commission resolution anymore," she told him. Silas looked up from the fence inventory he was working through. "What do you mean?" "I mean, fighting, it gives it weight. Every time we organize people to attend and Dace organizes his relationships to push it through, it becomes a bigger event. A bigger event means more visibility for Dace, even if he loses." She sat down. "We let it pass." Silas stared at her. "We let him win. We let him have a county resolution that contradicts a state assessor's formal finding. We let him file it, and then we let the state land office see a county resolution that directly contradicts their own assessor's work and decide what that says about the county commission." A pause. The state doesn't like being contradicted by county bodies on survey methodology. Drummond's office will respond to a county resolution that challenges his assessment, and the response will not be quiet or internal. She leaned forward. Dace thinks the resolution gives him cover. What it actually gives him is a document that invites state scrutiny of the county commission's relationship with a surveyor under review. Silas sat back. He turned this over. She watched him do it. The specific quality of his thinking process, which was slower than hers but more thorough, the way he checked the edges of a plan before he accepted the center of it. "Callaway," he said, "Callaway votes against it on the record. We make sure that's documented. We make sure it reaches Drummond's office before the regular session is 3 days old. And if Tillis and Pratt understand what they're actually doing, men like Tillis and Pratt don't understand what they're doing until after they've done it. That's what makes them useful to people like Dace and dangerous to everyone else." She paused. "Callaway understands. That's enough." Silas was quiet for a long time. "You're using Dace's move against him," he said finally. "I'm letting Dace's move complete itself. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "I'm not doing anything." She looked at him directly. "I'm just not stopping him from making a mistake that was always going to be a mistake." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression she had come to know best on him. Not the rancher's assessing look, not the deliberate thinking look, but the other one, the one that had been appearing more frequently over the past weeks, the one that didn't have a practical function she could identify and therefore occupied a different category entirely. "All right," he said, "send a note to Calloway. Tell him to vote no, make sure it's entered in the full record, and send you a copy of the minutes." "And we don't organize anyone for the session?" "We don't organize anyone. We let the room be whatever it is," Silas wrote to Calloway. The regular commission session happened on a Thursday morning that Adeline spent entirely in the kitchen. She made bread. She tended the smokehouse. She worked through a supply inventory that needed doing anyway. She had a long, meandering conversation with Nellie about the relative merits of different dried pepper varieties for long-cooked beans, which was a real conversation and not a distraction from anything, because Nellie's understanding of the kitchen had reached the point where her opinions on ingredients were worth discussing seriously. Doran came back at noon. "It passed," he said. 7-1. Calloway voted no. "It's in the minutes." Adeline nodded. "Full record?" "Full record." Calloway also entered a formal statement of objection citing the conflict with Drummond's state assessment. "That's in the minutes, too." "Good." She went back to the bread. "Send the minutes to Silas's lawyer today. Ask him to forward them to Drummond's office with a covering letter." Doran looked at her with the particular expression he had been giving her more frequently lately. Not quite surprise, more like the ongoing confirmation of something he had already suspected. He left without asking why. She knew why, and he knew why, and the knowing was enough. Drummond's office responded in 8 days. The response was a formal letter to the Copper Ridge County Commission informing them that the Commission's resolution of March had been received and reviewed, that it appeared to directly contradict the findings of a state property assessment conducted by a certified state assessor, and that the State Land Office was therefore opening a review of the County Commission's basis for that resolution, including any communications between Commission members and parties to the disputed boundary claim. Tillis received his copy of that letter on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, he had contacted Dace's attorney. By Thursday, Dace's attorney had withdrawn the counterpetition from the State Land Office proceeding. Doran brought that news with coffee, which he almost never did. The coffee was a signal that the news was worth sitting down for. "Withdrawn," Adeline repeated. "Withdrawn without prejudice, which means he can refile. But he won't." "How do you know?" Doran looked at his cup. "Because Tillis also announced he won't be seeking re-election at the end of his term. And because 2 of Dace's major cattle buyers from Fort Worth sent letters to the Copper Ridge Feed Association last week clarifying their purchasing arrangements." He paused. "Apparently they prefer to do business with operations that don't have ongoing State Land Office reviews attached to them." Adeline was quiet. "Calhoun?" she said. "I don't know for certain, but Calhoun was at the Sunday dinner on the pasture. He talked to Drummond for 20 minutes before the assessment." Doran shrugged with one shoulder. "Men talk to each other. Buyers talk to each other." She sat with this for a moment. She had not planned that specifically. She had not called Calhoun, had not sent word, had not asked anyone to speak to Fort Worth buyers. She had cooked a meal on an open pasture in March wind and invited the county and let the county see what it needed to see, and what the county saw had moved outward in the way that things moved in a place where everyone's livelihood was connected to everyone else's reputation. Her mother used to say, "Build the table right and let the table do the rest." She had never understood that fully until now. "Is it over?" she asked. Doran considered the question with his usual honesty. "Dace isn't gone. He still runs the biggest cattle outfit in the region, and he'll be in business when the rest of us are old. But the northern pasture," he shook his head, "he won't move on it again. The cost is too high now." She nodded. She went back to work. The legal documents were finalized on the first Friday of April. Adeline had had them reviewed by a lawyer in Harrison County, not Silas's lawyer, her own, because the document affected her, and she needed eyes on it that were looking out for her interests specifically. The lawyer, a thin, gray-haired woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who operated out of a single office above a dry goods store and who had been practicing property law in Texas for 22 years, read the draft twice and made 3 changes and said the revised version was fair. "More than fair," she said, looking at Adeline over her reading spectacles. "The land valuation is generous." "I know," Adeline said. "You trust this man." It wasn't entirely a question. "I've watched him for 5 months," Adeline said. "He does what he says." Mrs. Pruitt looked at the document again. The co-ownership structure is clean. You'll want to make sure the operational autonomy clause is exercised. That means you run the dining business without requiring his approval on operational decisions. That was my addition to the draft. Good addition. She handed it back. Sign it. Adeline signed it. Silas signed it the same afternoon at the kitchen table, with Doran and Nellie as witnesses, which was not how property documents were typically witnessed, but was how Silas had wanted to do it. In the kitchen, at the table, in the room where everything had actually happened. Mrs. Pruitt, who had ridden out from Harrison County specifically because Adeline had asked her to, and because she said she liked seeing legal work done in the right spirit, notarized it, and said she'd have the filed copies back within 10 days. When she left, Silas looked at the signed document for a moment. Marlowe table, he said. Adeline looked at him. That's what you want to call it? It's what it is. He looked up. Your name should be on the building. She thought about her mother's handwriting on the recipe cards, her father's slanted left-handed letters, the battered tin box that had crossed Louisiana, Arkansas, and most of Texas with her. All right, she said. Nellie, who had been working quietly at the far end of the kitchen and pretending not to listen, made a sound that was clearly not a cough. The building went up in late April and into May. Silas hired a local carpenter named Aldous, who built things the way things should be built, without shortcuts, without vanity, with the understanding that a structure was going to stand longer than the person who commissioned it and should be designed with that in mind. Adeline was involved in every decision about the interior, which meant the kitchen was exactly what a working kitchen needed to be. The stove positioned for proper ventilation, the larder built against the north wall where it stayed cooler, the prep surfaces at a height she specified, the dining room laid out to allow movement without crowding. The sign went up on a Thursday. Marlowe table, hand-lettered in black on a pine board, simple and direct, visible from the main road into Iron Hollow. Nellie stood outside and looked at it for a long time. Say something, Adeline said beside her. I'm thinking. About what? Nellie turned to look at her. She was 16 when Adeline had arrived, and something about the past 5 months had moved her forward in ways that were visible in how she stood, how she spoke, how she moved through a kitchen. When I came here, I was carrying dishes and getting yelled at for breaking them. Nobody showed me anything. Nobody told me why anything worked. You were wasted, Adeline said. I didn't know I was wasted. I thought that was just how kitchens were. Adeline looked at the sign. They don't have to be. I know that now. A pause. You're the reason I know it. Adeline was quiet for a moment. She thought about all the kitchens she had walked into and all the times she had been told, in one form or another, that she was taking up space she hadn't earned. She thought about the weight of that. Not the anger, which had never served her well, but the weight, the slow accumulation of being categorized before being seen, the energy it took to keep moving through rooms that had already decided what you were. She thought about what it would have meant, at 19, walking into her first hired kitchen, to find someone who showed her why things worked. Kitchen manager, she said. Nellie looked at her. That's your title. Kitchen manager of Marlowe table. I'll put it in the employment papers. Nellie stared at her. You're 17, Adeline added, which is young. But young means you've got time to learn every mistake before you're 30, which is an advantage most people don't have. Nellie looked at the sign again. At Marlowe table in plain black letters. Okay, she said, in a voice that was smaller than her usual one. Adeline went inside. There was work to do. The first Sunday at Marlowe table brought 61 people, not because it was a special occasion. There was no announced event, no particular draw beyond the fact that the building was new and the food was the same food that had been drawing people for 5 months. 61 people simply came because the table had become a place that people came to, the way certain places became that over time, without any single moment you could point to and say, here is where it started. Clara Marsh came. She brought her 2 children and the friend whose husband had told her about Tillis's commission meeting, and she sat at the long table near the window and ate and talked and laughed at something one of the other women said. And Adeline watched her from the kitchen doorway and thought, this is what my mother meant. Not the food, not the building. This. People at a table who wouldn't otherwise be in the same room, finding that they have something in common after all. 2 women from the eastern edge of the county came for the first time. One of them had ridden 20 miles, which was not a small thing. She said she had heard about the place from a cattle buyer who had told her husband that Iron Hollow had the best table in the region, and her husband had said that sounded worth a Sunday. And here she was. Adeline put extra pie in front of her. Rhett, who had been, over the months, slowly and imperfectly, and without ever explicitly acknowledging what he was doing, becoming a person slightly different from the one who had stood in the kitchen doorway making comments, volunteered to help carry tables from the barn when the dining room reached capacity and the overflow needed somewhere to sit. He did it without being asked. He did it wrong the first time and right the second time, which was about his usual ratio for most things. Adeline noticed. She did not say anything to him about it. Some things were better received without comment. Doran ate his Sunday dinner at the end of the long table closest to the kitchen, the way he always did, and afterward he sat with his coffee longer than he needed to, which was also the way he always did, and at one point he looked up and found Adeline looking at him from the kitchen doorway, and he gave her the small, contained nod that was his version of saying something important without using words. She nodded back. Silas found her at sunset. The last customers had gone. Nellie was finishing the kitchen, the ranch hands had drifted back to the bunkhouse. The new building was settling into the particular quiet of a place that had been full of people and was now empty in the good way. Not abandoned, just resting. He came around the far side of the building where she was standing, looking at the cottonwoods along the creek. The same cottonwoods she had seen on her first day, bare and winter gray. They were full-leafed now, moving in the warm evening air, and the creek beyond them was running with the spring runoff, shallow and clear over the flat stones. He stood beside her, and they were both quiet for a moment. "Good day," he said. 61 people. I counted 63. 2 left before I could count them properly. She kept looking at the trees. The state filing came back. I know. Iron Hollow's boundaries confirmed. Golt's been suspended pending the methodology review. Also know that. He paused. Dace signed a letter withdrawing all claims to the northern pasture this morning. His attorney delivered it. She turned to look at him. Signed and witnessed, he said. It's filed. She turned back to the cottonwoods. She waited for relief to arrive and found something more complicated. Not relief exactly, but the feeling of a weight she had been carrying without fully accounting for simply becoming lighter, which was different from being gone. It would take time to fully register. That was all right. It's over, she said. That part is. She looked at him sideways. What part isn't? He was looking at the creek with the expression he had been wearing more openly over the past weeks, the one she had stopped pretending she didn't understand. I've been trying to figure out how to say something, he said, without it sounding like it's connected to everything that just happened, because it isn't connected, it's separate. Then say it separately. He turned to look at her. I don't want you to be here because of the building or the papers or anything I can offer you in terms of the ranch. I want you to be here because you want to be here. She looked at him. And I want to know, he continued, whether you do. Want to be here, not for the table, not for what we've built, for... He stopped. Tried again. I'm not good at this. You're doing all right. I'm doing terribly. He looked at the creek. Martha used to say I could negotiate a cattle deal in my sleep, but I couldn't tell a person I cared about them without sounding like I was reading from a bill of sale. She wasn't wrong. A short, startled breath that was almost a laugh. No. Adeline looked at the cottonwoods. She thought about the 8 miles she had walked in winter cold with 50 cents in a leather bag and a tin box of recipes. She thought about standing in his barn and saying, "Give me one supper," and meaning it completely. She thought about all the rooms she had walked into where the decision about her had already been made, and how she had learned to make the decision herself about whether those rooms were worth staying in. This one was. It had been from early on. She had known it and been careful with the knowing because careful was how she operated when something mattered. Not cautious in the way of fear, but careful in the way of someone who had learned that the things worth having were worth not rushing. I walked 8 miles to this ranch, she said. He looked at her. I walked 8 miles in bad weather with everything I owned in one bag, and when I got here you looked at me like you were deciding whether I was worth the conversation. She wasn't saying it with bitterness. She was saying it with the plain honesty she used for things that were simply true. And I didn't leave. I asked for one supper, and I stayed. I know. I stayed because the kitchen was worth staying for, and then because Nellie was worth staying for, and then because the Sunday table was worth staying for. She looked at him directly. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, it stopped being about any of those things specifically and became about something I didn't entirely have a name for. Silas was very still. Do you have a name for it now? He said. I have several. I'm being selective. His mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close. She looked at the creek. You gave me one opportunity, she said. One supper. That's all it started with. And I think about that sometimes. How close it came to not happening. What if the woman at the dry goods counter in Millard Creek had been busy? What if I'd been a day earlier and the position hadn't opened yet? What if you'd said no and I'd kept walking? I wasn't going to say no. She looked at him. What? After you said give me one supper, if they don't eat it, I'll leave tonight. He paused. I'd already decided. Nobody talks like that unless they know exactly what they can do. She looked at him for a long moment. You could have said that on the first day. I didn't know how much it mattered yet. He looked at her steadily. I know now. The cottonwoods moved in the evening wind. The creek ran over its stones, somewhere in the bunkhouse. Someone had started up that badly tuned harmonica again, the same one she had been listening to for 5 months, and it was still imperfect and still, in the fading warmth of a spring evening, not entirely unpleasant. Silas, she said. Yeah. Ask me. He looked at her, really looked, the way he had started doing months ago in the kitchen when neither of them was naming what was happening, the way that had nothing to do with assessment and everything to do with someone who had stopped looking at the surface of a thing and started seeing what was underneath it. Will you marry me? He said. Not a performance, just the words, plainly, the way he said things that mattered. She looked at the creek for one more moment. You sure you can afford me, Cowboy? He was quiet for a beat. I've been trying to afford you since you asked for $14 a month, he said. She turned to look at him. Something in her chest, some tight, defended, carefully maintained thing that had been there since she was 16 years old standing outside a burning building with a tin box of recipes and nothing else, came a little undone. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just slightly, in the way that things came undone when they finally decided the situation was safe enough. Yes, she said. They married in June, under the cottonwoods beside Marlowe table. Not a large ceremony, not because they lacked the people to fill one, but because neither of them was a person who needed an audience for things that were real. Calloway came. Clara Marsh came with her children. Doran stood near the back in his Sunday clothes, which looked exactly like his weekday clothes, but cleaner. Rhett was there, standing with the other ranch hands in the particular posture of young men. At occasions they aren't sure how to behave at, which is to say, slightly stiff and trying not to show it. Mrs. Pruitt came from Harrison County. Nellie stood beside Adeline. The cottonwoods were full and green, and the creek was visible through the trees. And the building with Marlowe table on its sign stood behind them, with the kitchen fire already going, because there would be food afterward, because there was always food. What happened at Iron Hollow over the following years was not the story that traveled. The story that traveled, the one people told across Copper Ridge County and the neighboring counties, and eventually through the cattle trading networks that connected Texas to the wider world, was the story of the rich rancher who hired a homeless cook and changed her life. People who actually knew Iron Hollow told it differently. They said that a woman walked in out of the cold and asked for one chance to prove what she could do. They said she took a broken-down kitchen and a neglected smokehouse and a ranch that had gone cold after loss and made it into something people drove 20 miles on a Sunday to sit inside. They said she outthought a man who had never been outthought before. And she did it not with weapons or money or political power, but with food and information and the understanding that people were the most important thing any piece of land could have on it. They said she built a table and the table built everything else. There is a lesson in that, if you want one. It isn't about cooking, though cooking is where it happened. It isn't about romance, though love found its way in, as it tends to do when people stop pretending they don't need it. It isn't even about the land or the legal fight, though both of those were real, and both of them mattered. The lesson, if you can call it that, and maybe it's more a thing you carry than a thing you state, is something about what happens when a person decides that the room they're standing in has already made up its mind about them and they decide to make a different decision anyway. Not a loud decision, not an argument or a declaration or a confrontation. Just, give me one supper. Just, the work, done right. On whatever equipment is available, in whatever cold kitchen presents itself. For whatever group of people haven't yet figured out that they're about to have their opinions changed. Adeline Marlowe spent her childhood being taught that a restaurant was not a restaurant, it was a place. She lost the building, she kept what made it a place, and she carried that thing in a battered tin box through Arkansas and most of Texas until she found a piece of ground where it could take root. That is not a small thing, it is in fact the whole thing. Years later, the recipe tin still sat in the Marlowe table kitchen, her mother's handwriting, her father's slanted left-handed letters. And behind them, in Adeline's own hand, dozens of new cards, recipes built from 5 years of feeding Copper Ridge County, adapted for oak smoke and Texas winter, and the particular tastes of the people who came back every Sunday. And every morning, early, before the kitchen opened and before the ranch was fully awake, Silas Creed walked across the yard and came through the Marlowe table door and sat at the end of the long counter. And Adeline put bread in front of him. And they were quiet together for a while, in the way of people who had found something worth being quiet about. The bread was always good. That was never the only